Hey guys, tonight we begin with the curious, crusty, and quietly horrifying world of Victorian bakers. Imagine that you are a baker in Victorian London, a man whose life begins long before the Sunday. It is 3:30 in the morning. The city above you still sleeps, its alleys shrouded in fog, its rooftops glazed with soot. The sound of hooves echoes faintly through the wet cobblestones as you pull on your apron, rough with old flour. The air is cold, damp, and heavy with silence, except for the low growl of the oven already alive below. You descend into your shop, a cramped cellar lit by the weak glow of a single gas lamp, its glass smudged with smoke and grease. You stoke the fire. The coals flare, hissing orange and red against the soot-darkened bricks. The heat wraps around you, pressing against your skin, until the chill of dawn disappears. You wipe the sweat from your brow, not from labor yet, but from the nearness of that open mouth of flame. This is your world. Heat and hunger, rhythm and repetition, the scent of yeast, the sting of ash, the constant hum of exhaustion. By 4 o'clock, the dough must be ready. You work by instinct, measuring by hand, kneading by feel, folding the mixture of flour, salt, and water until it breathes beneath your palms. Outside, London still dreams, its fog curling around the lamplight like ghosts. Up there, no one knows your name, but when the first wagons roll past your street at sunrise, the smell of your bread will reach them warm, sweet, alive. To them, that scent means comfort, safety, home. It's the perfume of survival, the promise that morning has come again. Yet you know what hides behind it: the ache of sleepless nights, the choking clouds of flour dust, the danger of the furnace that roars inches from your face. The same warmth that brings others peace is what burns you slowly from the inside out. Bread is life, they say. But here, in this dim London cellar, bread is also death hidden beneath a golden crust. The flour may be stretched with chalk, the dough laced with alum or ground bone, poisons meant to please the eyes of those who never question the hands that feed them. Every loaf you make is a small act of faith and defiance, a balance between nourishment and decay. So, how did it happen? How did the simple act of baking that ancient craft of sustenance become one of the most dangerous jobs in Victorian England? How did the men who fed the empire become its silent casualties, dying by inches from the very work that gave them purpose? Through heat, hunger, and hidden toxins, the Victorian baker became both creator and victim, feeding a nation while being consumed by his own creation. His fire gave warmth to others, even as it hollowed him out. And tonight, as we travel back through that smoky world of ovens and shadows, we'll uncover the truth, the story of the men who rose before dawn, labored in the fire, and vanished into the flour-dusted air of history. If you enjoy exploring these forgotten corners of the past, the quiet, haunting lives behind everyday things, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more tales from the darker, sleepier side of time. Now, take a breath, settle in, and let's return to the fire. The fire from the previous night has not yet died down when the baker returns to it. He never really left. In a sense, no Victorian baker ever did. They lived in rhythm with the oven, its pulse their own, its hunger their master. It is a little past 3 in the morning. The fog outside is still thick, clinging to the corners of the alley like wet wool. The city above is a sleeping giant, silent, except for the faint rumble of carriages in the far distance. But down here, in the narrow belly of London, life is already underway. Inside the brick-walled bakery, the glow of a single oil lamp quivers with each movement. The light is weak, trembling, but it catches everything: the thin sheen of flour on the workbench, the dull gleam of copper pans stacked by the wall, the dark stains where steam has eaten the plaster over the years. The air is heavy with yesterday's smoke. The smell is not unpleasant, exactly, but it clings to the lungs like a ghost that refuses to leave. The baker, a man of 40, though the soot and sleeplessness make him look 60, moves without sound. He has been awake since midnight, though it's hard to call what he does waking. There's no clear line between his nights and days anymore, only a blur of work and faint rest. His hands move automatically, pressing and folding the dough, pushing his whole weight into it as if forcing life into a body that no longer wants to rise. Outside, the world dreams of breakfast. Inside, he's already trapped inside it. The rhythm of his labor is both mechanical and intimate thud. Roll, fold, sigh. Each motion ends with a small puff of flour that rises like smoke. His breath catches it. He inhales his own trade, and the dust coats his throat, his eyes, the lining of his chest. He coughs once, quietly, then wipes his sleeve and continues. The oven breathes behind him, a living animal, its mouth red and trembling. He remembers when this used to feel noble, the work of a craftsman, a feeder of families, the invisible warmth behind every home. But that was years ago, before the exhaustion became permanent, and before every loaf began to feel like a small act of penance. Now, the work is survival. The dough no longer feels soft or alive beneath his fingers. It feels heavy, unyielding, like clay. The clock on the shelf, its face yellowed by soot, ticks faintly through the quiet. 3:15. Soon, the apprentices will stumble in, wiping their eyes, already dusted in flour before they've even begun. But for now, he works alone, and there is something sacred in that solitude, a quiet that belongs to no one else in the city. The walls of the bakery are slick with condensation. The floor is a mosaic of footprints, flour turning to mud underfoot. Each print marks a night like this one, another morning pulled from sleep to serve the hungry daylight. His own prints layer the oldest. He has been walking this floor for 20 years. He knows every creak, every hiss of the oven, every sound the fire makes before it spits. He looks toward the narrow window, high on the wall. Outside, the alley glows faintly blue with the coming dawn. Somewhere above, milkmen are loading their carts, and the first sweepers are brushing soot from the gutters. The baker can almost smell the air beyond the smoke, fresh and cold. The air he hasn't breathed in years. But the fire calls again, a deep, cracking sound that demands attention. He takes the iron peel and slides another tray into the mouth of the oven, its light flooding the small room like sunrise. His forearms are slick with sweat. His shirt clings to his back. He wipes his brow and leaves a streak of white across his skin. It is the mark of his profession, the baker's mask, some call it, that ghostly coating of flour that never truly washes away. He pauses for a moment, his hands resting on the bench. The dough he shaped lies in neat rows, rising slowly under linen cloths. He watches them, and for a brief instant, there is peace. The slow swell of yeast, the quiet heartbeat of the bread coming to life. It is still beautiful to him, even now. He knows what each loaf will become: a meal for a family, a crust for a soldier, a treat for a child who will never know his name. But the peace never lasts. He turns back to the oven, coughs again, harder this time. The flour is everywhere now, falling from the air like snow. It lands on his shoulders, his hair, his eyelashes. It makes the whole world pale. Outside, the city stirs. Somewhere, a bell tolls 4. The bakery begins to hum with faint life, the rustle of aprons, the muttered greetings of boys half asleep. The apprentices begin to weigh flour, to measure water, to stir. The rhythm builds, kneading, turning, shaping. The room is full now of heat, of motion, of breath. The smell of yeast grows thick, and still, the baker works in silence. There's no talk, no song, only the sound of labor. He is part of the machinery now, one gear in the endless clockwork of hunger and habit that turns the entire city. Up above, London will soon wake. Chimneys will smoke, newspapers will rustle, and breakfast tables will fill with warm bread. No one will wonder where it came from. No one will think of the man who stood in the dark while they slept, coughing into the fire, shaping life out of ash. For now, the ovens roar. The fire consumes and renews. And the baker, the quiet, unseen heart of the waking city, continues his work, bound to the rhythm of heat and hunger, a ghost among the living, baking the morning into being. The heat is rising now, the kind that blurs the edges of the world and turns breath into steam. The doughs from earlier, pale and trembling under their cloths, are ready. The bakery feels alive in the worst possible way, hissing, crackling, groaning, as though the walls themselves are sweating. Outside, Dawn has barely broken, but inside, time no longer exists. Only the oven matters now, the monster of fire and brick that rules this small underground kingdom. It sits at the far end of the room, a massive half-circle built into the wall. Its stones blackened by decades of coal smoke. The opening gapes like the mouth of a beast, red light pulsing within. Every baker who's ever stood before it knows that sound, the deep, living hum of burning coal, the low rumble that seems to breathe. The fire eats everything, the air, the flour dust, the sweat off the men's skin. It demands constant feeding, constant obedience. The baker is not its master. He is its servant, chained to its rhythm, bound by its hunger. There are no dials here, no thermometers, no measurements of precision. Only instinct, the old, dangerous kind passed down from hand to hand. To test the heat, the baker does what his father did before him, and what every baker in London has done for generations. He thrusts his bare arm into the mouth of the oven. It happens fast, a motion so natural he barely thinks of it. He opens the iron door with a scrape, leans forward, and stretches his arm inside. The air within is shimmering, molten, thick enough to feel solid. The skin of his arm prickles instantly, the tiny hairs curling in the heat. He counts in silence. 1, 2, 3. At 5 seconds, he pulls back, his breath sharp, too hot. The bread would burn before it rose. He closes the door and waits, listening to the hiss of the fire dying slightly as it devours another lump of coal. The scars on his arms, white smooth bands running from wrist to elbow, are his credentials, his education, his proof of craft. No certificate, no guild license, no diploma can rival them. Each mark tells a story of misjudged flames, of nights when the bread turned black, when the master shouted, when the wages vanished. Every baker's arm bears the same script, written in heat and time. To the untrained eye, it looks like madness. But in this world, pain is knowledge. The good bakers, the ones who can feel the right temperature in their skin, are the ones who keep their families fed. A few seconds too soon, and the loaves stay raw and heavy, their centers still wet, their crusts pale. A few seconds too late, and everything turns to ash, not just the bread, but the night's wages, the entire effort of hours lost in one glowing instant. The difference between sustenance and ruin is measured in burns. The apprentices watch from the corner, silent, pale under the flour that coats their faces. One of them, no older than 13, winces each time the baker opens the oven. He's seen the others blister their hands trying to prove themselves, seen the skin peel off like parchment. Still, he knows that soon he'll have to learn it too, to test the heat, to trust his arm instead of his eyes. That is the way of things here. The baker wipes his forearm with the corner of his apron, smearing soot across the pale scars. He bends to shovel coal into the furnace, his face lit red from below. The iron rod clangs against the stone, sparks flying up like fireflies. The room smells of sulfur and ash, of effort and fear. There's a strange rhythm to it, the scrape of the shovel, the hiss of fire, the thud of the door closing, a kind of industrial heartbeat that matches the city above. Outside, the first carts are rolling. London is waking. But here, underground, the world has narrowed to this glowing mouth of brick and flame. It is both tool and tyrant, a creature the baker must appease, hour after hour. The fire never rests. Even when banked, it breathes. It hums in the bones of the room, in the bones of the men who serve it. Sometimes, when the baker looks too long into the oven, the light seems alive, shapes forming and shifting, as though something inside is watching back. He laughs at himself for thinking it, but he knows better than to stare too long. The fire has a way of hypnotizing the tired, pulling their thoughts into its red whirl. More than one man has leaned too close and paid for it in flesh. The baker pulls open the iron door again and slides in the first tray of loaves. The heat lashes his face. He works quickly. Each movement practiced, one arm shields his eyes, the other guides the wooden peel. In they go, the rows of dough disappearing into the heart of the blaze. He closes the door and waits. The minutes that follow are the most dangerous kind of silence, full of potential, of dread, of invisible alchemy. He knows what must happen in there. The slow swelling, the skin of the crust tightening, the yeast dying in a burst of heat. giving its last breath to flavor. But he can't see it. He can only feel the temperature on his skin, smell the faint sweetness that leaks through the cracks. When the scent sharpens, when the air changes just slightly, he'll know it's time. Another baker once told him that the oven tests a man's soul. Too cautious, and you ruin the bread. Too bold, and you ruin yourself. The balance lies somewhere in between, in that narrow space between creation and destruction where the loaf turns golden, where heat becomes life instead of death. The baker reaches for the door again. The iron handle sears his palm, but he doesn't flinch. He's long past the stage of noticing pain. He opens the door, pulls out a tray, and the room fills with a burst of light and scent, sweet, charred, alive. The loaves are perfect. For now, he exhales slowly. The relief, almost like prayer. Around him, the boys begin to move again, carrying trays, stacking baskets, sweeping ash from the floor. The oven crackles softly, content for the moment, its hunger briefly sated. But the baker knows the peace won't last. The fire will need more coal soon, more tending, more flesh. It always does. The city outside may be moving toward breakfast, to its first comfort of the day, but down here, the battle with the monster continues. The oven gives warmth to the world, yes, but it also takes. Every loaf costs something. A layer of skin, a breath, a heartbeat. The baker looks at his arms again, the pale lines of old burns catching the lamplight. They gleam faintly, like the veins of marble. Proof, not of pride, but of survival. Proof that he has fed the fire and lived to feed it again. He wipes his face with a soot-blackened cloth, adjusts his cap, and returns to the bench. Another batch waits, dough rising like the next tide. Behind him, the oven murmurs low, a sound between a sigh and a growl. And so, the day begins again in heat, in labor, in devotion to the brick-built God that devours men and pays them back in bread. The loaves are out of the oven, now stacked high on wooden racks, their crusts still crackling. The room filled with the smell of victory and exhaustion. The fire has been fed, the heat briefly appeased. But though the baker has conquered the flames for another hour, another enemy rises quietly in their place, unseen, unending, and far crueler than fire. It begins with the flour. The dust hangs in the air like mist, fine as breath itself. Every movement, every knead, every slap of dough on the table sends it billowing upward in ghostly clouds. It clings to everything, the walls, the tools, the men. It glows softly in the flicker of the oil lamp, as if the whole room is caught inside a snow globe of slow, suffocating beauty. At first, it seems harmless, even comforting, that familiar haze that means work is being done. But as the day stretches on, the air thickens. The flour mixes with coal, smoke, and sweat, turning into something heavier, coarser, alive. Each breath scrapes down the throat like fine sandpaper. The baker wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and tastes chalk. His chest tightens as he leans over the table again. The motion of kneading forces his lungs to work harder, drawing in more of that pale poison. He doesn't notice it anymore, not fully, just the weight that builds with every hour, pressing against his ribs. He coughs once, twice, the sound sharp and hollow in the small space. The apprentices glance at him, then back at their own work. They've all heard that cough before. They all know what it means. They call it the baker's lung, though no one in the bakery uses that name aloud. To the doctors, it's a chronic inflammation, flour dust, filling the lungs, hardening the tissue, suffocating a man inch by inch. To the bakers, it's just the price of living. The symptoms come quietly at first. A tightness when you bend, a wheeze when you climb the stairs, a cough that doesn't leave when the cold does. Then the fainting begins, the dizziness that hits near the oven, when the air is thin and hot and the lungs refuse to pull in more smoke. The baker feels it now, that faint ringing in his ears, that brief flicker of darkness at the edge of his sight. He steadies himself against the bench, waiting for it to pass. He's been through this before hundreds of times. A moment later, he straightens, wipes his hands, and carries on. The bread doesn't wait. To breathe was to bake, the narrator might whisper, and to bake was to suffocate slowly. Every inhale carries more than air. It brings in flour, ash, and the residue of burning coal. The lungs fill with ghosts, Even the eyelashes collect white, and when he blinks, the world turns pale. The apprentices sweep the floor every hour, but it's useless. The dust returns before the broom is set down. It rises from the sacks, from the cracks in the wood, from the clothes on their backs. There is no escaping it. By noon, the air is opaque. The men move like shadows in fog. Their voices are hoarse, their laughter broken by coughing fits. When they drink water, it turns milky from the residue on their lips. The oven glows steadily in the background, adding its own poison to the mix, smoke curling from the seams, coiling into the air, joining the flour in a slow dance of death. The heat dries their throats, sears their nostrils, but they can't stop. If they rest too long, the dough will overproof, collapse, and sour. The rhythm must go on. Knead, lift, turn, breathe, burn. Some nights, when the work is done, and the fire finally allowed to die, the baker steps outside into the street, into the open air. The first breath of real London air, damp, cold, metallic, feels like heaven, but the relief is brief. He coughs again, deeper this time, a shudder that shakes his whole frame. Sometimes there's blood, sometimes not. He wipes it away and says nothing. The next night, he'll be back in the cellar again, feeding the oven, feeding the dust. His wife used to beg him to leave the trade. "You'll die in there," she'd said once, pressing a damp cloth to his chest when the coughing fits came. He'd smiled weakly, the way bakers always do when death is mentioned. "Aye," he told her, "but I'll die warm." That was the truth of it. Warmth was the only comfort this life offered. The heat of the fire, the heat of the sweat, the heat of the bread itself. Everything else was cold. The pay, the beds, the hearts of the men who hired him. As years passed, his breathing worsened. Each inhale came with a rasp, like wind through dry reeds. At night, when the city slept, he could hear his own lungs crackling faintly in the dark. Still, he returned every morning before dawn. He couldn't stop. A baker's hands don't forget the motion, even when the body begins to fail. The apprentices began to whisper about him. "Old Tom's lungs are going," they said. "You can hear it when he laughs." But no one mocked him. They all knew their time would come. The flour never forgives. Inside the bakery, the dust has its own rhythm, rising with the kneading, settling with the silence. It becomes a second atmosphere, one that coats the inside of your thoughts as much as your lungs. The bakers move more slowly now, not from laziness, but from caution. A sharp breath or sudden movement can send the whole cloud whirling again. The older men tie damp cloths around their mouths, but it doesn't help much. The flour finds its way through the weave. It's finer than smoke, more patient than air. It seeps into everything. The youngest boy, trying to copy the others, wraps his scarf across his nose. He lasts half an hour before pulling it down, gasping for air. The baker watches him, and for a moment, he almost smiles. He remembers when he was that boy, when the flour seemed like snow, when the air still smelled of sweetness instead of sickness. He remembers the thrill of shaping his first loaf, of seeing it rise golden from the fire. He hadn't known then that each breath of that same air was cutting his life shorter. Now, even the smallest motions cost him. The simple act of bending to lift a tray sends pain lancing through his ribs. He grits his teeth and keeps moving. Stopping is worse. Stopping gives the body time to remember it's dying. The doctor who examined him last winter had shaken his head and said words like chronic, irreversible, occupational. The baker hadn't understood half of them, but he'd caught one phrase clearly: "Your lungs are turning to stone." He'd laughed at that, not cruelly, just quietly. "Good," he'd said. "Maybe they'll last longer than I do." Now, as he moves through the haze of his shop, he can almost believe it. His chest feels solid, heavy, immovable. When he breathes, it's as if something grinds inside him, two stones rubbing together, a slow erosion that never stops. The apprentices keep their distance when the coughing starts. It comes in waves deep, racking fits that shake the whole table, send the flour puffing up again in sympathy. The sound fills the room like thunder, then fades, leaving only the hiss of the oven and the baker's ragged breathing. When he finally straightens, his face is gray beneath the flour. Outside, dawn has fully broken now. Light filters weakly through the grimy window, turning the haze golden. The city above begins its day, milkmen shouting, doors opening, bells ringing. But down here, the air never clears. The dust never settles. It simply renews itself, just as the bread does, just as the men do, generation after generation. In this place, to breathe is to bake, and to bake is to suffocate slowly. The baker leans against the table for a moment, his hands trembling slightly. He looks toward the window again, toward the faint gleam of daylight that never seems to reach this far. Somewhere beyond the fog and smoke, life continues, clean air, open skies, a world untouched by flour and fire. But that world isn't his. He pushes himself upright, dusts his hands, and reaches for the next lump of dough. The rhythm resumes. The room fills once more with the sound of kneading and coughing, of life being made and unmade at the same time. And in that dim, airless space beneath the city, the baker's world continues, not in joy, not in despair, but in duty. For as long as the ovens burn, as long as London wakes to the smell of bread, there will be men like him, shaping warmth for others, breathing dust for themselves, fading quietly into the haze of their own creation. The flour settled on everything like snow, soft, silent, deceiving. The baker brushed it from his sleeve and watched it drift through the thin light, floating lazily before vanishing into the haze that filled his small cellar. The room was warm, the air heavy, the smell almost sweet. A stranger might have found comfort in it, but the baker knew better. There was something hollow about the scent now, something faintly metallic that clung to the back of the throat. The dough before him was pale, too pale. Once, bread had been brown, coarse, hearty, solid as the men who ate it. But that was before London began to worship the color white, before the millers and merchants discovered that purity could be manufactured and sold by the sack. He kneaded in silence. The flour was smooth, almost slippery, finer than it had ever been when he was a boy. In those days, flour had texture. It clung to the fingers like earth. Now it felt lifeless, as if it had forgotten what wheat even was. He worked the dough by instinct, the motion so familiar his body performed it without thought. Yet the result was no longer the same. The dough stretched strangely, elastic and shining, its surface too clean to be natural. Outside, London was growing faster than the smoke that choked its skyline. Streets doubled, houses multiplied, and mouths appeared faster than bakers could feed them. Bread was the city's pulse. Every alley, every factory, every poorhouse ran on it. 50 pounds a week for the average family, more if there were children. It was the measure of comfort and the currency of hunger. And the wider the loaf, the greater the illusion of security. The people wanted purity. They wanted the color of refinement, of progress, of everything they could not yet afford but longed to believe they deserved. The millers understood this hunger better than anyone. They stripped the wheat until it was bare of life, then gave it a new one, brightened with chalk, lightened with alum, weighed down with powdered bone. Flour became chemistry. Bread became disguise. The baker received it ready-made, tied in coarse brown sacks stamped with elegant black letters. Imperial fine flour, royal white. He never asked what those words meant. It was not his place to ask. The bread had to rise, the customers had to eat, and the city above had to go on believing that breakfast was an act of innocence. The oven breathed beside him, glowing like a captive Sunday. He could feel its heat even as he worked at the far table, shaping loaves in careful rows. The fire roared, and the light caught the flour in the air, making the room shimmer. The baker's face, powdered and damp, looked ghostly in the reflection, half man, half statue of dust. He coughed, turned away, and continued kneading. The flour had changed the rhythm of the work. It rose faster, baked quicker, and stayed soft long after it should have gone stale. The bread looked perfect, white, smooth, delicate, but inside it was dense and heavy. When sold by weight, that heaviness meant profit. Bread that should have fed one family now fed a ledger instead. The city loved it. Women queued for it in the mornings, their shawls drawn tight against the fog. Children followed the scent down the street, faces pressed to the bakery window. Clerks and doctors and clergymen bought it by the dozen. No one questioned how a simple loaf could look so pure in a world so dirty. They only wanted it to stay that way, unblemished, unreal. He'd heard rumors, of course. Every baker had. The flour was laced with chalk to make it white, with alum to keep it light, with ground bones to add weight. Some millers used plaster of Paris, a builder's material, not food. He'd even read once, in a newspaper discarded on a cart, that doctors suspected these substances of causing sickness in children, rickets, weakness, slow starvation of the body. But what could he do? The flour came as it came. If he refused it, there would be a dozen others ready to take his place. The customers never wanted brown bread. They said it looked dirty, coarse, and poor. Even when the city's reformers tried to warn them, when pamphlets were printed and inspectors spoke of poison, people still reached for the white loaf first. Truth was never as appealing as illusion. The color of health had become the color of disease. By mid-morning, the shelves were full. Rows upon rows of pale loaves lined the counter, their crusts thin and brittle, their scent drifting through the open door. The baker wiped his hands and looked at them, the perfect display of false purity. To anyone passing by, it was beauty. To him, it was weight. He thought of the flour dust in his lungs, the endless coughs that came at night, the sharp ache in his ribs when he bent. The poisons that whitened the bread had found their way into him too. The city was brightening outside. The fog had thinned. Sunlight glinted on wet cobblestones. A milkman's cart rattled by. A mother and her son paused at the window, the boy pointing to the loaves with eager eyes. She smiled faintly, reached into her purse, and stepped inside. The baker turned, took one of the loaves, and wrapped it in paper. The bread was warm against his palms. He handed it over gently, almost with pity. She thanked him, and the door closed again. He stood still for a long moment, listening to the receding footsteps. Then he turned back to the bench, dusted off the remaining flour, and reached for the next sack. Another batch, another morning. The rhythm went on: mix, knead, bake, repeat. The city's hunger was endless. Behind him, the pale loaves cooled slowly in the golden light. Their surfaces shone faintly, smooth and spotless. They looked clean enough to be holy, but if you tore one open, you could still see it, the faint gray streak beneath the crust, the secret hiding in the white. Outside, London's bells began to ring, calling the city to work, to progress, to another day of industry and illusion. The baker listened to the sound as he opened the next sack of flour. The dust rose around him again, filling the air, settling on his skin, slipping into his breath. In the glow of the fire, it almost looked beautiful, the particles shimmering like sunlight through fog, the world wrapped in quiet whiteness. But the beauty was a lie, just like the bread. And as he lifted the dough and turned it in his hands, he felt again that strange smoothness, that cold, false perfection, the color of aspiration, the dream of an empire, the pride of a century, all of it distilled into this one thing, this symbol of nourishment that hid its own corruption. The loaf gleamed in the light of the oven, white as bone, white as deceit, white as death. By the middle of the century, the whiteness of bread had become more than fashion, it was faith. Londoners spoke of it with a kind of reverence, the same tone reserved for churches, manors, and the Queen herself. To eat white bread was to be proper, to belong, to rise above the grime that stained the city's lower streets. It gleamed in the bakery windows like marble carved into loaves, and people admired it as they might admire a crown jewel, both distant and desirable. The baker watched them from behind his counter, their faces softened by morning light and hope. He saw the same story repeated every day. The factory clerk with his polished shoes is buying half a loaf, careful not to seem poor. The nursemaid was counting coins before choosing one small roll for her mistress's breakfast tray. The mother with a child in her arms, whispering to the boy to wait until they got home before biting into it. The rich ate white bread to feel civilized. The poor ate it to look civilized. In Victorian London, class was a costume, and bread was one of its buttons. A white loaf on the table spoke of gentility of education, self-control, moral worth. Dark bread was for laborers, for those who sweated and bent and never rose. A household that served white bread was a household that had arrived, or at least wanted to pretend it had. The newspapers reinforced the illusion. Advertisements printed in delicate cursive promised the purest loaves in London, bread fit for gentle homes. Illustrations showed angelic women slicing snowy loaves beside spotless children and flowers in crystal vases. No one mentioned the mill dust or the powdered bones. Purity, after all, was not about truth. It was about the performance of it. The baker understood this theater better than anyone. His shop was a stage, and every loaf a prop. The light from his window caught the crusts just so, a faint golden sheen atop flawless ivory. The smell wafted into the street like an invitation to grace. His customers never stayed long. They bought, they smiled, they left. They didn't want to see the heat, or the sweat, or the ash that made the illusion possible. When he sliced a loaf, the inside was almost luminous. White, dense, too perfect. It did not crumble the way real bread should. It held its shape as if embalmed. Sometimes, days later, the leftover loaves on the counter looked the same as when they had come from the oven, pale, untarnished, eternal. They never molded, never turned stale, never died. That should have been a warning enough. But London was a city that thrived on denial. Smoke covered the streets, soot stained every wall. And yet people filled their parlors with white linens and pale bread, as if purity could be purchased in defiance of the world. It was a strange kind of religion. This worship of whiteness, part moral, part aesthetic, entirely human. The baker had seen it reach absurd extremes. Wealthy patrons requested bread so white it bordered on blue, like the underbelly of a fish. One even complained that a batch looked too natural. They called it refinement. He called it delusion. Still, he made what they asked for. A baker who refused a customer's taste didn't stay in business long. He thought often of how quickly the city had changed. When he was a boy, brown bread had been the common meal of London, simple, hearty, filling. But as the mills grew faster and the middle class grew hungrier for appearances, white flour had become the currency of ambition. The same technology that built railways and telegraphs had found its way into the grain. The whiter the flour, the higher the status. Progress had turned color into hierarchy. Even in the poorest neighborhoods, families saved what they could to buy a white loaf on Sundays. It sat in the center of the table like a trophy. Children were told to eat slowly, to savor it, to remember that civilization had a taste soft, light, faintly sweet. The irony was cruel, that the very bread meant to signify health and virtue carried within it the seeds of sickness. Chalk for color, alum for texture, bone dust for weight. They baked respectability into arsenic. The baker sometimes wondered if anyone ever tasted the truth beneath the lie. The bread had a subtle bitterness now, metallic and dry. But people mistook it for sophistication, a flavor refined, genteel, belonging to progress. When he tried once to bake a batch of the old brown kind, whole grain and earthy, his customers frowned. "It looks poor," they said. "It smells wrong." He never made it again. On market mornings, the streets were filled with the scent of it, hundreds of ovens exhaling the perfume of civilization. From Chelsea to Clerkenwell, the air shimmered with warmth and deceit. Every shop displayed its own shades of white. Some tinged cream, others ivory, each promising something better than the last. Bakers competed not in flavor but in purity. Whoever made the lightest loaf earned the heaviest purse. Even the churches joined in. Sermons compared moral cleanliness to the whiteness of bread, the purity of one's soul reflected in one's table. Housewives whispered recipes for angel loaves that would keep longer and bake paler. It was said, half jokingly, that the closer your bread came to the color of bone, the closer your household was to heaven. The baker had no heaven, only his fire. He watched the city eat itself in small, polished bites. He saw how the men who worked the mills grew pale and bent from the dust, how the children of his customers coughed and weakened, their bones softening as if they were being kneaded from the inside out. And still the people came, clutching their coins and their pride. At times, he imagined London as one great loaf, rising endlessly bright on the outside, rotten beneath. The city's progress puffed it up, made it beautiful and hollow, until one day it would collapse in its own heat. He didn't know if anyone else saw it that way. Most bakers didn't think at all. They worked, they coughed, they died. The bread went on. The illusion endured. There was always someone new to feed the fire. One morning, after a sleepless night, the baker stood at his counter, gazing at a fresh row of loaves cooling on the rack. They looked almost alive in the glow of the window, breathing faintly as they cooled, their crusts whispering as they contracted. Outside, London moved like a tide hansom cabs, street hawkers, school children with satchels, all of them bound by the same hunger for appearance, for the shine of respectability. He wondered, briefly, if anyone would notice if the bread turned black one day, if he fed the city something real instead of something pale and poisonous. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. The fire needed tending. The next batch was ready. He lifted the new dough, soft and lifeless in his hands, and laid it gently on the peel. The air shimmered with heat. As he slid the loaves into the mouth of the oven, the light from the coals danced across his arms, catching on old scars that gleamed faintly in the glow, pale against his skin, pale as the bread. Outside, the bell of Street Mary's rang the hour. The city stirred. Windows opened. The scent of baking drifted upward, blending with fog and smoke. And for another day, London believed in its own purity. White bread ruled the breakfast tables of an empire. It was wealth you could chew, virtue you could swallow, a dream you could digest without question. No one asked why it shone like marble or why it never spoiled. They simply ate, satisfied, their plates as spotless as their consciences. The baker watched them through the window, his hands folded on the counter, his apron dusted with ghostly flour. The loaves glowed behind him, pale monuments to a civilization that had mistaken color for cleanliness and taste for truth. In that era of smoke and ambition, the whiter the loaf, the darker the story behind it. And in the end, London's obsession with purity was not found in its hearts or its souls, but in its bread, a perfection so false it could outlast rot itself. The fire had been burning since before dawn, and by mid-morning the bakery had turned into a furnace. The walls seemed to breathe with heat, the ceiling dripped with it. Even the iron tools, when touched, felt alive. The baker could feel the temperature rise with each batch, a steady, suffocating climb until the air itself felt thick enough to knead. 40 degrees, maybe more. There were no thermometers to confirm it, only the slow shimmer of air above the ovens and the way the skin refused to stay dry. His shirt clung for the first hour, then surrendered entirely. Soon, all of them journeymen, apprentices, old hands were stripped to the waist, their bodies shining like the bread they worked to feed. Sweat ran down their arms and pooled in the small of their backs, leaving ghostly streaks in the flour dust that covered everything. The floor was slick with it. The benches, the walls, even the peel handles were damp from the constant exhalation of men and fire. They worked in rhythm, wordless and automatic, the scrape of wooden paddles and the hiss of the oven filling the space like breath. Outside, London was just waking up. Inside, it already felt like midday in hell. No one complained anymore. Complaints were for new apprentices. The veterans accepted it, their skin permanently flushed, their muscles lean from years of baking heat. The younger ones still tried to joke, wiping their faces with floury hands and leaving streaks of white like war paint. They said the dough rose better when it caught a baker's sweat. Extra salt, they called it. A dark joke that made them grin even as their eyes burned. It wasn't entirely untrue. The dough absorbed everything: dust, fatigue, flakes of skin, the faint bitterness of exhaustion. The air was so dense that every breath seemed to taste of yeast and salt and labor. Each loaf was a fragment of their bodies, a small, warm offering of flesh and effort. By the end of a long shift, a baker could look at the bread cooling on the racks and feel, quite literally, that he had put himself into it. The ovens demanded constant attention. There were no gauges, no safe distances. To check the temperature, one had to thrust an arm inside, not for long, just a heartbeat, long enough to feel whether the fire was alive or dying. The skin toughened over time, scarred and calloused, the marks of a trade both admired and pitied. No badge, no certificate could prove a baker's worth like the pattern of burns along his forearms. When the fire grew too fierce, they opened the door to the alley for a breath of cooler air. It rarely helped. The London fog mixed with the bakery steam, turning the doorway into a curtain of gray. Outside was smoke and soot. Inside was heat and dust. There was no escape, only the choice between burning lungs and clogged ones. Sometimes, The youngest boys would step outside for a moment, their faces pale and slick, leaning against the wall as if the bricks could give them strength. The master would shout for them to come back, not out of cruelty, but because the dough waited for no man. The yeast didn't care for mercy or exhaustion. It rose as it pleased, and the baker followed its rhythm. The smell of the place was intoxicating to outsiders, warm, buttery, alive. But for those who lived inside it, it was something else entirely, a heavy, cloying perfume that coated the throat and lingered long after the fire went out. It mixed with the scent of coal, of sweat, of singed skin. To breathe here was to taste work. At the end of the day, when the last loaves had been pulled from the oven and set to cool, the men would sit on overturned barrels or flour sacks, their faces shining with grease and dust. The air shimmered faintly with heat even after the fire was damped. They drank from tin mugs of weak beer or water gone warm in its jug. The conversation was minimal, the laughter tired but sincere. Someone might repeat the old joke about extra salt, and they'd all chuckle, though none found it particularly funny anymore. They were proud of their work, in a quiet way. Bread was life, and they were its makers. But there was also something tragic in that pride, a knowledge that their devotion to the craft would one day kill them. Most bakers didn't grow old. The heat and the dust and the endless nights wore them down faster than years should. Their lungs hardened, their backs bent, their eyes reddened. They coughed, they wheezed, they pressed on. When new apprentices arrived, they were easy to spot. Their skin was soft, their faces hopeful. They thought the work was noble, even romantic, the poetry of bread, the warmth of the hearth, the dignity of feeding a city. Within a week, that illusion melted away, just like everything else in the heat. The bakery stripped men to their truth, just as it stripped their bodies of comfort. The baker remembered his own first weeks. He had been 16, eager and naive, his arms trembling from lifting trays of dough heavier than he was. The master back then had laughed when he first burned himself on the oven lip. "Now you're one of us," the man had said, slapping him on the shoulder. The skin had blistered for days. He still bore the faint outline of that moment on his forearm, a white scar amid the flush of heat-darkened skin. Years later, that same scar shone faintly under the light of the fire. It was one of many. Each mark told a story, a forgotten loaf, a slip of the hand, a moment of carelessness in a world that allowed none. The baker had learned to move with precision, almost like a dancer, quick, efficient, economical. The rhythm of baking was in his blood now. Even his heartbeat seemed to follow the pulse of the oven. The heat never left. It followed him home, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his skin. His small rented room always smelled faintly of burnt yeast and sweat. Sometimes, lying in bed with the window open, he would dream of cool places, rain, rivers, snow, but even in sleep, he felt the fire's glow on his back. He would wake damp and aching, the air heavy with the ghost of the day's labor. The city above his shop rarely noticed the men behind its morning bread. People saw the loaves in the windows, admired their golden crusts, and thought of comfort, never of suffering. The baker knew this well. He had seen fine ladies wrinkle their noses at the sight of a flour-streaked worker on the street, unaware that the scent they adored, that heavenly smell of fresh bread, came from the same sweat they found repulsive. The irony was constant and cruel. They called it the smell of home, that warm aroma drifting through open doors and narrow lanes. But for those who created it, home was a distant idea, a place without fire, without flour, without the endless churn of dough. And yet the baker stayed. They all did. Something was binding in the rhythm, something almost sacred in the act of creation. The dough might take his sweat, but it also gave something back, a strange kind of immortality. Tomorrow, someone would tear open one of these loaves, breathe in the scent, and feel comforted. They would never know whose body had labored to make it, whose breath had filled its rise. The bakery was still. The fire, banked low, hummed softly in the brick belly of the oven. The men moved slowly now, scraping the tables clean, stacking trays, sweeping flour from the floor into soft white dunes. The air was thick, golden, shimmering with exhaustion. As the baker reached for his shirt, hanging limply on a nail by the door, he noticed the faint pattern of flour on his chest, pale streaks shaped by sweat and motion, like ghostly fingerprints left by the work itself. He brushed them away, but the dust only rose and settled again, as it always did. Outside, the day was bright and hot, the city alive with noise. He stepped into it quietly, his body steaming in the cool air. The bakery's door closed behind him, trapping the heat within, ready to wake again before dawn. He knew he would return. They all did. The fire demanded it. The dough would rise, and he would rise with it. Flesh and flour, sweat and salt, bound together in the quiet alchemy of labor. In the end, it was impossible to tell where the baker ended and the bread began. Both were born of the same heat. Both rose under the same burden. And both, sooner or later, would crumble into dust. By midnight, the bakery belonged to the rats. When the ovens cooled and the last footsteps faded up the stairwell, they emerged from cracks and corners, a small army of shadows with glinting eyes. They came for the crumbs, the warmth, the scent of yeast that clung to every surface. The baker pretended not to notice them during the day, but at night their presence was impossible to ignore. They moved like smoke through the flour sacks stacked along the walls, their tiny paws leaving trails in the dust. Sometimes he would hear them before he saw them, the faint scuffle of claws, the squeak of teeth against burlap. Other times, a sack would shift slightly, as if breathing. He had learned to tell which ones were infested just by their sound, a faint rustling, constant and soft, like the heartbeat of the building itself. Every bakery in London had them. The warmth of the ovens, the crumbs from the benches, the endless supply of grain. It was paradise for vermin. They thrived underfoot, in the shadows between barrels, in the narrow crawl spaces behind the fire. The baker sometimes joked, bitterly, that the rats worked longer hours than he did. When he came down before dawn, he often found the traces of their feast, gnawed sacks, scattered seeds, a faint musky smell clinging to the air. Once, he had lifted a lid from a flour bin and seen one inside, frozen in death, half buried in white. Its tail had stiffened, sticking out like a thread of licorice. He had thrown the whole lot away, or at least most of it. There wasn't time to waste every contaminated batch. Some nights, necessity outweighed disgust. He wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't alone. Every baker in the city fought the same losing battle. They trapped, they poisoned, they cursed, and still the rats came back. London itself was their kingdom, its alleys alive with their whispers, its drains pulsing with their secret traffic. The bakeries were simply the warmest outposts in their empire. In the poorer districts, children told stories about them. They said rats brought luck to a bakery, that their presence meant plenty, abundance, good trade. No rats, no bread, they whispered with solemn superstition, watching the creatures dart through the alleys at night. To the hungry, even vermin could be a sign of fortune. The baker had seen the darker side of that folklore. There were rumors, half jokes, half confessions of tales baked into loaves, of customers slicing their bread to find something that squirmed, something that had been alive only hours before. Most of these tales were exaggerations, though not all. The bakery was a machine that never stopped. Accidents happened, and sometimes they were simply brushed away, buried beneath the endless demand for more. He remembered one night in particular. It was midsummer, the heat unbearable even after midnight. He had fallen asleep on a flour sack, the sound of the fire still echoing in his ears. When he woke, something was moving under his arm, quick, soft, and unmistakably alive. A rat, plump and unafraid, had nestled into the warmth beside him. For a moment, they regarded each other in the half-light, two exhausted creatures sharing the same shelter. Then it vanished into the shadows, leaving only a faint impression in the flour. After that, he stopped trying to kill them. It felt pointless, almost cruel. They were survivors, just as he was drawn by hunger, driven by instinct, thriving in the same heat that burned him. Sometimes, as he kneaded dough, he could hear them in the walls, a faint, scratching rhythm that matched his own. Strangely, their presence became part of the bakery's pulse, as constant as the fire or the dust. Still, not everyone was so tolerant. Inspectors came, sometimes thin men in long coats, carrying ledgers and grim expressions. They would sniff the air, frown at the walls, and make notes about unhygienic conditions. The baker hated their visits. They never stayed long enough to see what the work demanded. They spoke of purity and cleanliness, But none of them had ever baked through a London summer with no ventilation and sacks of grain stacked to the ceiling. They wrote their reports, took their notes, and left. The rats remained. At night, when the city quieted, their sounds filled the void. The baker would sometimes sit on his stool, elbows on his knees, staring into the embers while the rats scurried behind him. Their claws made a soft, restless music, a reminder that life, even in filth, persisted. He had begun to think of them not as invaders, but as witnesses. They saw everything: the sweat, the burns, the long hours, the moments when exhaustion made him careless. They were the only ones who stayed. One morning, just before dawn, he found a dead one near the oven, small, gray, curled as if sleeping. It had crawled too close to the heat and never made it back to its hole. He swept it up gently with a shovel, then hesitated. The creature's fur was singed, its body coated in a thin dusting of flour. It looked almost like one of his loaves, pale and still, waiting to be baked. He stood there for a long moment, staring, before finally tossing it into the ash pit. The fire flared briefly, then settled again. He couldn't help but wonder how many others had met the same end unseen, slipping behind barrels, crawling into sacks. The ovens roared, indifferent. The work continued. The loaves rose, and the customers came. The line between nourishment and decay blurred a little more each day. Sometimes, when children pressed their noses to the bakery window, he heard them giggle and whisper, "See the rats, Mama? They say they bring luck." Their mothers would hush them, pulling them away, but he caught the flicker of belief in their eyes, as though the superstition carried a tiny spark of comfort. London was hungry, after all. If rats meant abundance, then perhaps they were angels of a kind. But the baker knew better. The rats were not omens. They were proof that the city's appetite consumed everything, that even pestilence could find prosperity beneath the illusion of progress. The same warmth that baked the bread gave life to them. The same hunger that filled his shop filled their nests. By late morning, when the sun finally broke through the soot-streaked windows, the rats retreated again into the cracks, leaving the bakery to its human masters. The fire reclaimed the room. The men returned, sleeves rolled, ready to feed the endless demand. The baker swept the floor, the white dust rising around him like smoke. For a moment, it almost looked clean. He looked at the shelves, now empty, waiting to be filled again. The scent of the night lingered faintly, a mix of yeast, sweat, and something darker. He knew it would never truly leave. The rats would come again, as they always did, patient and faithful, waiting for the silence that came after men had finished pretending they were in control. That evening, when he locked the door and doused the lamps, he paused before leaving. The shadows were already alive, shifting faintly in the corners. He could hear the faint rustle of their tiny feet against the flour sacks, the whisper of hunger that never slept. "Good night, then," he murmured under his breath. Not a curse, not quite a blessing, just an acknowledgement between survivors. As he stepped outside, the streetlight caught his face, and for a moment, the soot and flour made him look almost like them, pale, gray, restless. He walked away through the fog, leaving the bakery to its other inhabitants. Inside, the fire sighed, the flour settled, and the rats began again gnawing, living, waiting. In the quiet of the night, the boundaries blurred once more. Man, beast, bread, all born of hunger, all consumed by it. When the rats slept and the city stirred again, the baker returned to his bench, sleeves rolled, eyes half closed from another night spent between fire and fatigue. The flour sacks stood tall beside him, patched and dusty, not all of them pure. Some were from the cheaper mills, others from suppliers who promised a refined product for half the price. It was a word that sold well in Victorian London. Refined. Refined sugar. Refined manners. Refined bread. The illusion of improvement. The perfume of progress. Among those sacks, hidden in the folds and whispers of commerce, was the real secret of every pale, perfect loaf alum. It came as a fine white powder, soft as ash, cold to the touch. To the untrained eye, it looked harmless, almost elegant. The millers sold it in little paper parcels or barrels marked with faint chemical stamps, claiming it kept flour fresh, kept dough elastic, kept customers coming back. Bakers called it the doctor's dust. Merchants called it efficiency. London called it purity. No one called it poison. At first, the baker had been wary. He'd heard stories, apprentices collapsing from stomach cramps, customers fainting after their morning toast, but the stories were always distant, belonging to someone else's street, someone else's oven. His own customers were alive and smiling. His loaves sold quickly, the white ones most of all, and besides, everyone used it. The flour came laced with it before it even reached his door. The first time he noticed a difference, it was in the dough itself. It felt obedient, softer beneath his hands, pliant, almost eager to rise. It stretched without tearing, baked without burning, and held its shape long after the ovens cooled. The crust came out smoother, the color paler, the weight lighter. It was perfection, or the illusion of it. Customers noticed too. They said his bread tasted clean, delicate. They said it stayed fresh longer, that it was easier to digest, though the irony would only reveal itself later. Some even claimed it made them feel healthier, more modern. White bread was the food of civilization, after all, and civilization demanded sacrifice. The baker took pride in his work again. The coins clinked louder in the till, and the queue outside grew longer. He was feeding London, giving it the purity it craved. Yet, with each batch, something invisible crept deeper into the loaves, something cold, metallic, silent. Alum worked like a patient executioner. It didn't kill quickly or dramatically. It eroded. It gnawed from within. The stomach, stripped of its natural acid, could no longer digest properly. Food sat heavy and undigested, rotting slowly inside. The kidneys strained, the blood thinned, the bones weakened. Those who ate it daily, the poor, the children, the workers, began to pale in more ways than one. Their eyes lost color, their hair dulled, their minds fogged. The doctors called it fatigue, malnutrition, hysteria. Few traced it back to the morning loaf. John Snow, the same man who would later trace cholera to the city's water, once suspected the bread. He had noticed that even those who drank clean water seemed to sicken, their limbs brittle, their growth stunted. He wrote about it that the very food meant to nourish might, in truth, be the source of decay. Few believed him. After all, bread was sacred. Bread was life. The government knew, of course. The inspectors, the politicians, even the merchants. They'd read the reports, seen the samples, heard the quiet outcry from doctors and reformers. But regulation costs money. Testing costs time. And no one wished to anger the millers, whose fortunes fed half the empire. The problem of alum was quietly filed away, buried beneath profit and denial. The baker didn't think about any of this. He couldn't afford to. His life was a cycle of kneading and coughing, of flour and fire. He used what was given, sold what was asked for, and counted what little he earned. Sometimes, when he closed the shop late at night, he'd notice his own reflection in the window, the pale skin, the hollow cheeks. He looked, he realized, not unlike his bread. He had started to feel it too, the heaviness in his belly, the aching in his joints, the strange numbness in his fingers that came and went with the seasons. At first, he blamed the heat, then the dust, then age, but the fatigue deepened, a slow, gnawing weakness that no sleep could cure. When he tried to eat the bread he baked, it turned to clay in his mouth. There were whispers among bakers. Some said the powder caused madness, that it seeped into the blood and dulled the mind, that it made a man forget names, faces, years. A few laughed it off. We're all half mad anyway. They'd joke over mugs of weak beer, but in quieter moments, they wondered if the city itself was slipping into a kind of delirium, blinded by its own whiteness. Now and then, an inspector would visit, sniff around, make notes about cleanliness, and leave. Nothing ever changed. The baker began to suspect that the inspectors were more interested in being seen inspecting than in seeing anything at all. The government preferred allusion to truth, much like his customers. He often thought of his mother, long gone now, who had baked brown bread in a small village oven. It had been coarse, rough, full of life. She had lived to 60, with strong bones and bright eyes. He would never reach that age. None of them would. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when guilt flickered through him when he watched a child press its face to the bakery window, eager for a loaf that would someday weaken it. But the feeling always passed. Hunger was louder than conscience. One evening, as the fire dimmed and he sifted the flour for the morning batch, his hand brushed something cold in the bin. He looked closer, a small tin canister, its label faded but still legible. Alumen. The powder shimmered faintly in the lamplight, pale as frost. He held it up for a long time, turning it over in his hand. It was beautiful, in a cruel way, the kind of beauty London had come to worship. He thought of throwing it out, of swearing off the deception, of returning to honest bread. But honesty did not pay rent. Purity was profitable, and in the end, he was just another man trying to survive. So he measured a small spoonful, as he always did, and stirred it into the dough. The powder vanished instantly, swallowed by the mass like a secret. The dough felt lighter beneath his palms, easier, smoother, perfect. When the loaves came out of the oven, their crusts were pale gold, their insides white as cloud. They cooled in silence, the air sweet with illusion. Outside, London streets glowed with gaslight, the city feeding on itself. The baker placed the new loaves in the window. People would come soon, mothers, clerks, children drawn by the smell, by the promise of purity. They would eat and feel comforted. He would sell and feel nothing. The city would turn, and nothing would change. The powder of death worked quietly, invisibly, as all poisons do. It did not need cruelty to spread, only habit, hunger, and faith. Faith in the whiteness of things, faith in the shine of progress, faith that bread could not betray. And so, every morning, as the rats scurried home and the ovens flared awake, the baker returned to his bench, his hands already dusted with death. The dough rose obediently under his touch, soft and pale, a perfect reflection of its maker, worn, weary, and dissolving slowly from within. The city outside thrived, glittering in its industrial dawn. But beneath the glow of empire, in the small, hot rooms where men labored for bread, another empire was rising, an empire of poison, purity, and quiet ruin. And in that empire, alum was king. By the time alum had become a quiet fixture of every London bakery, the city was already living on borrowed health. The loaves gleamed whiter than ever, the profits higher, the customers satisfied. But the line between illusion and catastrophe had grown so thin that no one noticed when it finally tore. It began, as most tragedies do, with something small, an empty sack. The millers, ever efficient, ever economical, began to reuse the paper bags that once carried dye powders from the textile factories of the north. The dyes themselves were bright, vivid, and deadly pigments that had painted the wallpapers of parlors and the gowns of society ladies. They contained a substance both useful and cursed, arsenic. To the millers, the sacks looked harmless enough, a bit of dust clinging to the paper, nothing that a quick shake couldn't dislodge. Waste not, want not, that was the way of progress. So they filled them again, this time with flour, sealed them, and sent them off to London. The powder inside, white and fine, looked exactly as it should. The baker never questioned it. The sacks arrived, as they always did, labeled stacked, waiting to be turned into dough. He slit one open, the cloud of flour rising in the dim morning light like ghostly smoke. The air was filled with it. He coughed, waved his hand, and thought nothing of it. By the end of the week, the new loaves looked even whiter than usual, almost luminous. Customers praised him. He smiled faintly, tired and proud, unaware that death itself had passed through his hands. The first complaints came 2 days later. A clerk from across the street collapsed at his desk after lunch, clutching his stomach. A housemaid fainted while scrubbing a step. Then a whole family from the next ward, mother, father, 3 children, taken ill within hours of breakfast. The symptoms were strange: nausea, trembling, a burning in the throat, and then, most disturbing of all, the color. Their tongues turned green. Their skin grew pale, translucent, almost waxen. Their eyes clouded like glass left in the rain. At first, no one suspected the bread. Illness was a constant in London: cholera, consumption, fever. There was always something to blame. But the deaths multiplied too fast, too suddenly. Entire households stricken within hours. Doctors began comparing notes. All of them described the same eerie calm that came over the victims before death, a glassy serenity, as if their bodies had gone quiet before their souls could follow. By the end of the week, the city was whispering. Something was wrong with the bread. The authorities descended on the bakeries. Inspectors tore open flour sacks, tested crumbs, and scraped residue from ovens. The discovery shocked even them: arsenic, and plenty of it. The paper sacks, once filled with green dye, had left their poison behind. The flour had absorbed it. The bread had been delivered. It wasn't one bakery, or even a dozen. The contaminated flour had been distributed across several districts, baked into thousands of loaves. The numbers were staggering. Some said 200 dead. Others whispered 500. There were no official counts, only funerals. The newspapers were merciless. "The poisoned bread of London!" one headline screamed. "The people fed on death!" Another paper printed illustrations of skulls rising from ovens, of bakers cloaked in black. Crowds gathered outside shops, demanding answers, demanding arrests. But who was to blame? The millers who had reused the sacks? The bakers who had trusted them? The merchants who had sold the dye in the first place? The truth was cruelly simple. Everyone and no one. The baker whose loaves had started it all, a man known only as Thomas, didn't live long enough to see the full scandal. Within days, he fell ill himself. He had been tasting the dough, as bakers often did, licking his fingers clean after shaping the loaves. When the pain began, he thought it was exhaustion, the usual ache of long nights and bad air. But soon came the spasms, the trembling, the blindness. He collapsed beside his own oven, the fire still roaring, the air thick with the smell of his final batch. The apprentices carried him upstairs, but by morning, he was gone. His hands, those same hands that had fed 1,000, were gray and still, dusted with a faint green powder that would not wash away. London panicked. For the first time, the public saw the shadow behind their daily bread, the machinery of negligence and greed that turned sustenance into poison. Crowds stopped buying from local bakeries. Some refused to eat bread at all. The government pressed into action by outrage, sent chemists and inspectors to every mill and bakehouse. Regulations were drafted, committees formed. Yet even in the midst of the hysteria, one truth remained unspoken. The city had asked for this. It was London's own hunger for perfection that had summoned it. The endless demand for whiteness, for purity, for cheap abundance. It had driven every hand in the chain to cut one more corner, to save one more penny. And so, progress had come full circle. The pursuit of purity had ended in poison. For weeks afterward, the bakeries stood half empty. Some shops closed altogether, unable to recover from the stain of suspicion. The air, once fragrant with yeast and comfort, now smelled faintly of fear. When the ovens burned, they burned quietly, cautiously. The rats, of course, remained. They had survived everything: alum, heat, and now arsenic. They moved through the empty bakeries undisturbed, their bellies round, their whiskers dusted with ghostly white. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The creatures that had been symbols of disease were now the last things left alive. Eventually, the city moved on, as cities always do. The papers found new scandals, new fears. The bakers returned to their trade, and the people returned to their loaves. But something had changed, a tremor of distrust that lingered long after the headlines faded. Bread, once sacred, had lost its innocence. For years after, old women in tenement kitchens would tell the story to their grandchildren of the time when Londoners woke up to find death baked into their breakfast. "That's why we never waste bread," they'd say, handing out slices with trembling hands. "You never know when it might be your last." The baker's shop where it had all begun stood empty for months before a new tenant took it. The sign was repainted, the walls scrubbed, the ovens rebuilt. But beneath the fresh plaster, the old stones still reeked faintly of burnt flour and fear. Sometimes, when the wind was right, the neighbors swore they could smell something strange drifting through the alley, not quite smoke, not quite bread, but something in between. A reminder, perhaps, that every loaf carried its ghosts. The arsenic tragedy passed into rumor, then into history. Yet its lesson remained buried in the city's bones, that the pursuit of purity, unchecked, always turns toxic. The people wanted perfection white, soft, weightless, and they got it. It gleamed in the shop windows. It melted on the tongue, and it killed them softly, beautifully, completely. By the next decade, new laws were passed, new millers licensed, and new inspectors appointed. But the baker, if he had lived to see it, would not have been comforted. The fire still burned, the dough still rose, and the hunger for purity, for progress, for illusion, was the same as it had ever been. And in the faint white dust that lingered on every street corner, in every kitchen, in every breath, London still carried a trace of its own undoing, the ghost of arsenic, light as flour, silent as faith. After the fire, the baker's bench stayed cold, but the work never stopped. For every man burned, another took his place. And for every man too broken to return to the ovens, boys were waiting hungry, barefoot, and eager to earn a crust. They were called oven boys. London was full of them, orphans, street urchins, the forgotten children of factories and alleys. The city spat them out faster than it could feed them. For most, the bakehouse was a mercy compared to the workhouse. It offered a roof, a trade, and, most importantly, bread. What they didn't know was that it also offered ruin. They arrived small enough to crawl through the oven flues, to clean out the ash pits where grown men couldn't fit. The heat scorched their hair, singed their eyelashes, and turned their skin the color of brick. Their hands, soft at first, blistered within days. They learned quickly that a baker's compassion was a rare luxury. A loaf could not wait for pity. At 10, they could barely lift a dough trough. At 12, their arms were strong but crooked, molded by years of kneading and lifting. At 14, their backs had begun to bow, their lungs to fail. And by 16, if they lived that long, they were old men in boys' bodies, coughing, bent, and used up. The master bakers called them lads, but never by name. To them, boys were part of the machinery, as replaceable as the broom or the shovel. Oven boys, they'd shout, and half a dozen would come running, each one half asleep, hands white with flour, eyes red from smoke. They worked while London slept. By midnight, they were already awake, hauling sacks of flour twice their weight, cracking eggs into troughs, mixing the dough by hand. Their arms disappeared into the mass up to the elbow, the sticky warmth clinging to their skin like a second flesh. When they grew too tired to stand, they leaned against the table and kept kneading. Stopping wasn't allowed. The baker's apprentice, the boy he'd once trained before the fire, had been one of them once. His name had been Peter, and though he was gone, the memory of his small hands brushing flour across the bench still haunted the baker. There had been dozens like him, faces blurred by time, but stories all the same. Thin, trembling, stubbornly alive. They slept on sacks of flour in the corner, curled like stray cats, their breath faint and shallow beneath the constant hum of the fire. When morning came, they were shaken awake, covered in dust, their bodies stiff and cold. Breakfast was crusts soaked in tea, if they were lucky. Most days, they worked straight through hunger. Mistakes were not tolerated. A loaf burned, a tray dropped, a dough under-kneaded, the punishment was swift. A cuff across the head, a shove into the wall, sometimes worse. The older bakers didn't do it out of cruelty alone. They did it out of fear. A boy's error could ruin an entire night's profit. In a trade where perfection was survival, mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Still, the boys stayed. The street offered less. The bakeries, for all their pain, offered at least the illusion of belonging. They were part of something, the city's unseen heartbeat, the pulse of London's dawn. And there was bread, warm bread. Even if they were fed, the scraps, the burnt ends, the crusts too hard for customers, it was more than they would have eaten outside. Some of them laughed about it, their teeth dusted white with flour. Better a baker's dog than a beggar's child, they'd say. They learned to live in the heat. They learned to breathe through the dust. They learned that the sound of crackling fire meant safety, so long as it didn't grow too loud. But what they could never learn was rest. Their sleep was always shallow, their dreams always interrupted by the clatter of trays, the hiss of the oven, the call of "Oven boy, move your hands." The youngest often didn't last long. Their small lungs, still soft and pink, couldn't bear the flour fog. They coughed constantly, a hollow sound that echoed through the bakery like a ticking clock. The older men ignored it at first. Everyone coughed here. But when the coughing brought up blood, the boy would be sent home, or rather, out into the street, to cough himself into silence. Another would take his place by nightfall. Sometimes, one of the boys would vanish. No one asked questions. There were always more waiting at the door by morning. Eyes hollow, bellies empty. The master might ask, "You ever kneaded dough before?" And the boy would nod, though he hadn't. That was enough. In rare moments between batches, when the oven cooled slightly and the air was bearable, the boys would sit on the floor and talk in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the walls. They spoke of strange things, of the taste of sugar, of horses they'd seen on the street, of the river they'd never had time to visit. Some dreamed of becoming bakers themselves one day, masters, with apprentices of their own. But most knew better. The trade didn't promote, it replaced. The baker, older now and half crippled by the fire, sometimes passed by the bakehouse where he'd once worked. Through the cracked window, he could see them, the boys moving in the orange glow, shadows against smoke, their small hands quick and quiet. He saw himself in them, saw Peter, saw the endless cycle continuing, unbroken and unchanging. The city demanded bread, and boys were the cheapest ingredient. By 16, the ones who survived were coughing blood. Their joints swelled, their skin cracked, their eyes yellowed from years of coal and fatigue. Some drifted into other trades, chimney sweeps, factory hands, grave diggers, though none lived long. A few stayed, their bodies so used to the heat that the cold made them ill. They became bakers in turn, training new boys, continuing the same quiet inheritance of suffering. It was said that a true baker could be recognized by touch alone, the calloused palms, the burns, the faint tremor in the fingers. But the oven boys were a different breed. You could recognize them even in death. Their lungs, when cut open by doctors, were white, not pink, not red, but white, packed with flour dust. London, ever hungry, consumed them the way it consumed everything, without malice, without hesitation. The bread still filled the windows. The people still lined up. The city still woke each morning to the smell of baking. No one asked who had made it, or what it had cost. The baker sometimes imagined what the city would sound like if every oven went cold, if, for one dawn, the fire stopped and the boys slept through the morning. The silence, he thought, would be unbearable. The city would not know how to live without its daily ritual of heat and hunger. And so, the ovens burned on. The boys rose before the sun, their bodies thin and shining with sweat, their laughter echoing briefly before being swallowed by the roar of the fire. They didn't know they were dying. They only knew the rhythm: knead, bake, breathe, cough, repeat. By the time they were old enough to understand, their bodies had already betrayed them. Their youth, their breath, their years all traded for the warm glow of someone else's breakfast. And when the city ate its bread each morning, when the scent drifted through fog and chimney smoke, it carried something more than yeast and flour. It carried the ghosts of the children who had made its small hands that had shaped a nation's appetite and been devoured by it in return. They were the children of the oven, and London, in all its splendor, was built on their heat. By the time the boys became men, those few who lived long enough to earn the title, their bodies had already begun to fail them. The ovens never closed, the fires never rested, and neither did the men who served them. For years, they had breathed flour like fog, swallowed coal dust with every breath, bent their backs beneath sacks heavier than themselves. And so, quietly, inevitably, the sickness came. It didn't arrive like a plague, no sudden fevers, no mass hysteria, no headlines. It crept, slow and invisible, through the lungs and blood of the bakers. One cough at first, then another. A tightness in the chest that never eased, skin that turned pale beneath layers of soot and sweat. They called it the baker's cough, as if it were just another part of the job, another badge of the trade. But it wasn't just coughs. There was the fatigue, the kind that no amount of rest could mend, the kind that sank into the bones and stayed there. They woke each morning already tired, their limbs heavy, their eyes ringed with gray. The air they breathed was poison, and their bodies bore the proof. Wheezing lungs, swollen joints, slow blood. And then there was the lead. No one spoke much about it, but it was everywhere in the pipes that carried water to mix the dough, in the metal trays and tools they handled daily, in the cheap tins that lined the shelves. Some said it even lurked in the whitening powders, the refiners and purifiers that promised cleaner bread. They didn't know the science, but they knew the feeling, the sudden dizziness, the trembling hands, the dull ache behind the eyes. When a baker's hand began to shake, he'd laugh it off. Too much beer, he'd say. Or, the fires made me soft. When his fingers stiffened so badly he could no longer knead, he'd call it age even if he was only 30. The truth was too costly to admit. There were no doctors for men like them, no time to rest, no money for medicine. The only cure they knew was work, the endless rhythm that drowned out everything else. In the mornings, the bakeries looked alive, a flurry of movement, flour swirling like snow. But beneath the surface was exhaustion, ancient and absolute. Men coughed into their sleeves and went on mixing. They spat blood discreetly into buckets, wiped their mouths, and returned to the oven. The city needed bread. The city always needed bread. Sometimes, one would collapse. It usually happened quietly, without drama, a man dropping mid-task, his head striking the table with a dull thud, his hands still white with dough. The others would pause for a moment, lift him gently, and carry him to the alley. There was no time for mourning. Someone else would take his place before the next batch rose. Death is part of the job, one of them once said, and he meant it. They joked about it often. Humor was cheaper than medicine, and it cost nothing to laugh. The jokes made the sickness smaller, more manageable. A cough became a punchline. Fatigue became an old friend. They gave their ailments nicknames: the flour, fever, the baker's breath, the oven ache. They said it with pride, as if they'd earned it, as if suffering itself was a mark of craftsmanship. At the taverns, after long nights, they'd sit slumped over their mugs, their laughter echoing like the rattle of their own lungs. One man might wheeze so hard that the others teased him. "Careful, Bill, you'll bake yourself from the inside out." Another would groan that he'd trade a year of life for a week of rest, and someone else would raise his glass. "You'll get both soon enough." The laughter was hollow, but it was all they had. By their 30s, most were half-ruined bent backs, raw throats, eyes that no longer saw clearly through the haze of heat and flour. Some developed strange tremors, their fingers twitching like broken clockwork. Others lost sensation entirely, dropping trays without warning, staring at their own hands as if they belonged to someone else. Doctors, when they appeared, called it industrial fatigue, respiratory weakness, or neural exhaustion. Elegant names for slow death. But no one came to the bakeries with stethoscopes or salves. The physicians treated the factory owners, not the men who fed the city. The bakers were invisible, too common to save, too essential to stop. Sometimes the sickness turned cruel. Some men wasted away entirely, their skin gray and papery, their bones sharp beneath thin flesh. They grew forgetful, confused. Some wandered off mid-shift, leaving loaves to burn. Others simply sat down beside the oven and never stood again. The apprentices learned early not to ask questions. When a man didn't return the next night, someone else was hired. When a cough grew wet and red, they looked away. Death was not a tragedy here. It was a shift ending. The baker himself, older now, but still alive, carried the sickness like a shadow. He could feel it in his lungs, the dryness, the grit, the faint burn each time he exhaled. He tried not to think about it. The fire had already taken enough from him, but it seemed the air wanted its share too. Sometimes at dawn, he'd walk past the other bakehouses and listen to the sounds, the familiar scrape of paddles, the clatter of trays, the rhythm of coughing, the city's morning chorus. To most Londoners, that sound meant breakfast, comfort, stability. To him, it was the slow symphony of men dying for their bread. He thought of the boys, the oven children, how their small chests had heaved with the same coughs, their laughter drowned in the same dust. Most of them were gone now. The city had eaten them whole and asked for seconds. The baker never said it aloud, but he had come to believe that every loaf he had ever made carried a piece of someone, a trace of sweat, a breath, a heartbeat, maybe even an illness. The bread and the men were the same, both rising and falling under the same heat. In the end, the sickness didn't discriminate. Masters, apprentices, boys, all were claimed by it in time. The only difference was how long they could stand before falling. When one of his oldest friends, a man named Henry, who had baked beside him for 20 years, finally collapsed mid-need, the baker didn't call for help. He just stood there, hands resting on the dough, watching as Henry's chest stopped moving. He covered the man's body with a flour sack and kept working. The loaves were due by morning. That night, as he shaped the final batch, he caught himself laughing, a weak, breathless sound that startled even him. He laughed until he coughed, until his throat burned, until he had to lean against the table to steady himself. When the fit passed, he looked down at the dough beneath his hands. It gleamed softly in the light, smooth and pale, alive in its quiet way. "Death is part of the job," he whispered, and he meant it. Outside, the city was waking again, the fog thinning, the streets filling with the first carriages of dawn. The smell of baking drifted through the alleys, sweet and familiar. London breathed it in, grateful and unknowing. Inside, the baker wiped his mouth, smearing blood and flour into a single pale stain. He looked at the oven, still glowing softly, its heart steady as ever. It would outlive him, as it had outlived so many before. He set the final loaf on the rack, straightened his back with effort, and exhaled. The sound was faint, but in the silence that followed, it felt enormous, like the last breath of the fire itself. And then, without ceremony, he sat down beside the oven. The city kept breathing, the bread kept rising, and the silent epidemic went on. The smell of baking still drifted through the streets, warm and familiar, even as death worked quietly behind every oven door. It was almost poetic. The same heat that nourished the city also consumed the men who tended it. The same scent that meant comfort to Londoners meant decay to those who made it. And as the baker sat beside his fire, lungs trembling, eyes half shut, he knew his story was not unique. It was simply one of thousands, another quiet verse in the long hymn of exhaustion that filled the city's dawn. By the middle of the century, the sickness had become something so ordinary that no one thought to name it anymore. It was just the baker's way. Every man who worked the ovens coughed, every man limped, every man aged twice as fast as he should. They knew it, they saw it in one another, and yet they worked, because what else was there to do? The doctors who occasionally visited the bakehouses wrote it down in fine cursive: chronic bronchitis, respiratory inflammation, pulmonary fibrosis. They gave it Latin names that made it sound almost dignified, but inside those words was only dust flour that clung to the lungs, the same dust that made the bread rise so beautifully in the oven. The bakers breathed it every day. It coated their throats, filled their chests, settled like ash in the folds of their lungs. When they coughed, the air came out thick and wet, sometimes white, sometimes red. They joked about it. They had to. "Don't waste the flour, boy," an old baker would say, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of blood and dust. "It's worth a penny a pound." No one laughed for long, but they laughed anyway. Because humor, in a place where death was routine, was the only medicine they could afford. The baker's world had no hospitals for men like them. A doctor's visit cost more than a week's wages, and even if one came, what could he prescribe? Fresh air, perhaps, or rest. But there was no fresh air in London, not for the working class, and rest was a luxury reserved for the dead. So they cured themselves with ale and denial. They coughed and spat and kept working. If a man dropped, another took his place. That was how the city functioned. A body failed, a loaf rose, and life went on. Lead poisoning was another plague, quieter but crueler. The pipes that carried their water were lined with it, the trays they baked on coated with it, the utensils they used to stir and scrape steeped in it. Even the whitening powders used in the flour carried traces of lead. mixing invisibly with every loaf. It seeped into the blood, into the nerves, into the mind. At first, the symptoms were small: a tingling in the fingertips, a faint dizziness that came and went. Then, the tremors began, a hand that shook so slightly that only the man himself noticed. Within months, it would worsen until even holding a loaf became difficult. Fingers that once shaped dough with precision now fumbled clumsily. The shame was worse than the pain. Too much whiskey, they'd say, hiding the truth behind laughter again. But when one man's hand trembled so violently that he dropped a tray of hot loaves, scalding his legs, no one laughed. They helped him up, silent, their eyes heavy with the knowledge that his working days were done. There was nowhere for men like him to go. No pensions, no unions, no hospitals for the dying poor. Some wandered the streets until their breath gave out. Others simply went home, sat by a cold hearth, and stopped moving. The baker, older now, his back bent, his chest tight, watched it happen again and again. The boys he'd once trained, the men he'd worked beside, all falling one by one. The city devoured them as it devoured everything else. At night, he sometimes walked past the river, where the fog lay thick and still. The air there was heavy, but at least it was cool, free of flour and fire. He could breathe a little easier, though every inhale burned. He often thought about what it must feel like to have clean lungs to wake without the taste of soot in your mouth, without the ache in your ribs. But he had been breathing poison too long to remember anything else. The baker's humor, once dry and sharp, had dulled to something quieter. When someone asked how he was feeling, he'd shrug and say, "Still baking." It was an answer and an epitaph both. Some nights, the coughing fits were so violent he thought his ribs might crack. He would lean over the table, gripping its edge, his vision blurring. When it passed, he'd spit into a rag and stare at the red stain spreading across the fabric. It was almost beautiful, a color so vivid in a world of white. He began to notice it in others, too. The way the older men leaned against the wall when they thought no one was looking. The pauses in conversation when someone caught their breath too sharply. The way laughter turned to wheezing. Wheezing to silence. They joked about it still. "Death's part of the job," one said with a grin, his teeth brown from years of smoke. Another nodded. "Aye, and cheaper than rent." It was a cruel sort of comfort, this shared fatalism. To joke was to survive, if only for another hour. The newspapers never wrote about them. No one wanted to read about men who died in bakeries. There was no scandal in exhaustion, no spectacle in quiet death. Their obituaries were the loaves themselves, each one shaped by hands that would soon stiffen, baked in ovens that would outlive them all. The baker had begun to think of the trade as a kind of pact. Every loaf demanded a toll, a bit of breath, a bit of life. The city's appetite was endless, and the bakers fed it willingly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to give. He tried once to stop. His body begged for it. His cough had worsened, and his strength was waning. But within a week, he was back at the oven. Not out of pride, but because the silence frightened him more than the fire. Without the heat, without the rhythm, he felt hollow, a man unbaked, unfinished. The younger bakers still called him Old Man, though he couldn't have been more than 40. He looked twice that skin ashen, hair gray, hands curled like claws. But his eyes still held that strange glint of defiance, the stubborn light of someone who had outlasted too many others to give in quietly. When the coughing came for him at last, it did so without warning. One moment, he was shaping dough. The next, his knees buckled. The room spun. The others rushed to help, but he waved them off. "Finish the batch," he rasped. "Bread doesn't wait." They did as he said. The loaves went into the oven, the fire roared, and the work continued. By the time they pulled them out, he was gone, slumped beside the table, his hands still dusted with flour, his face peaceful in the glow. They buried him quietly. No priest, no sermon. Just a few men standing by the river, each one coughing, each one knowing it would be their turn soon enough. The next morning, the ovens burned again. The air filled once more with the smell of bread and ash, with laughter and death and everything in between. London ate its breakfast as usual, none the wiser. The bakeries went on each one a small hot cathedral where men prayed with their hands and died by their craft. And so, the silent epidemic continued, unrecorded, unremarked, but everywhere. It lingered in every crumb, in every crust, in every sigh that rose with the steam. The bread fed the city, the baker fed the bread, and death, quiet and invisible, fed on them all. The smell of bread never left the streets of London, not even after death. It drifted through alleys and over rooftops, mingling with the soot and fog like a kind of mercy. To those who passed by, it was the scent of life itself, warm, familiar, reassuring. But for the men who made it, that same smell had begun to sour, because behind the sweetness of baking lay something darker, something spoiled. The bakeries were dying from the inside, just like the men who worked them. After years of sickness and hunger, corners had to be cut, and when there was no money to spare, ingenuity took the place of morality. Flour was expensive. Good flour, nearly impossible. The mills sent whatever they could grind, often mixed with chalk or sawdust, and sometimes something worse. Spoiled wheat, damp with mold, was sold cheaply to the desperate. No one asked questions. In a trade where survival depended on weight and whiteness, truth became a luxury. The baker would open a sack and find it crawling, not always, but often enough. Mites, weevils, and the faint sour smell of decay. He would shake his head, sigh, and begin mixing anyway. Bread was bread, and the city would eat whatever rose in the oven. It wasn't always malice. Sometimes it was simply hunger, the kind that drove good men to terrible ingenuity. A handful of ash to cover the taste of rot, a splash of vinegar or salt water to disguise the sourness, a pinch of alum to brighten the color, to make the dough look clean again. Necessity, the narrator might say, bakes strange recipes. And it did. Each baker developed his own secrets, little rituals born of desperation. Some sprinkled ground chalk to make the bread whiter, others used plaster to give it weight. One man even stirred a handful of sugar into the mix to mask the bitterness, though sugar was far too dear for such waste. Another added soap shavings, believing it made the loaf rise higher. It worked for a time. When the dough was too thin, they thickened it with bone dust. When the smell turned rancid, they drowned it in salt. When the color dulled, they added alum until the loaf gleamed like ivory. No one spoke of these things, but everyone knew. The customers, of course, had no idea. They came to the shop each morning, eager and polite, their coins clinking on the counter. The poor bought the coarse loaves, gray and dense. The middle class demanded the pale ones, soft, shining, clean. They didn't want to know how it was made. They didn't want to imagine the hands that kneaded it, or what else those hands had touched. The baker, by now, could hardly taste anything himself. His tongue was coated with years of flour dust, his teeth ground down to stubs, but even he could smell when the flour had turned. Still, he mixed, he shaped, he baked. The loaves came out golden, the crusts crackled, and that was enough. Hunger, after all, forgives everything. By evening, when the last loaves had cooled, he would lean against the wall and listen to the city outside. He could hear the laughter of children, the chatter of market vendors, and the bells of carriages rolling past. Somewhere, someone was biting into his bread. He imagined their faces the satisfaction, the brief illusion of fullness. They would never know the truth, nor would they care. The bread kept them alive, even as it killed them slowly. There was irony in that, though it had long since stopped feeling funny. The spoiled flour brought its own sickness. Stomachs knotted, skin yellowed, teeth loosened. Children in the poorer districts grew thin and bent, their bones softening like wax. The doctors called it rickets or bowel disease, and sometimes blamed the air or the water. Few thought to look at the bread, but the bakers knew. They'd seen too much. They'd seen men sicken after tasting the dough, seen apprentices faint from the fumes of spoiled wheat. They'd buried enough to know what really fed the graveyards. Still, they worked. The baker's conscience had grown quiet over the years, worn down by routine and necessity. He told himself that if he didn't bake, someone else would. That the people would buy the same poisoned loaves from another shop. That he was only keeping them from starvation, a noble lie he told to sleep at night. Sometimes, when the guilt crept in, he'd knead the dough harder, punishing it as though the violence could cleanse it. His arms ached, His breath came shallow, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The city was hungry. On certain mornings, when the fog was especially thick, he imagined the air outside was made of flour, that London itself had become one giant bakery, choking on its own hunger. The smoke from the chimneys rose like sighs, and the fog tasted faintly of ash and salt. He wondered if the city knew it was being poisoned, or if, like him, it had simply learned not to care. The apprentices had learned the tricks, too. They knew how to hide the smell of rot, how to scrape mold off the top of a sack and stir the rest into the mix. They did it without thought now, their fingers quick and practiced. Some even took pride in it, the art of turning decay into sustenance. "You'd be surprised," one of them once said, "what people will eat if it's warm." And he was right. When the bread came out of the oven, golden and steaming, no one could tell the difference. The surface shone, the scent filled the air, and the illusion was complete. The poison beneath was invisible. The rot baked away into silence. The baker sometimes imagined the city like a great body, its veins full of bread instead of blood. The rich dined on soft, pale loaves, the poor on gray crusts, but both fed on the same sickness. The same hunger drove them all. It was strange, he thought, how hunger could make even poison holy. How something that should have repelled became instead a comfort, a necessity. He'd seen men fight for moldy scraps, seen mothers trade their last coins for loaves he knew would make them ill. But who could blame them? Bread was not food. It was survival. And survival has its own flavor. He tasted it every morning, the bitterness of spoiled dough, the metallic tang of alum, the faint grit of ash between his teeth. He'd stopped noticing long ago, but sometimes, when he handed a loaf to a child and saw the way their eyes lit up, something twisted inside him. The bread was warm. It smelled of safety, of life. And yet, he knew better. He once tried to make a clean loaf, no ash, no alum, no disguise. Just flour, water, salt, and yeast. It failed completely. The dough collapsed, the crust burned. The customers complained that it was too dark, too heavy. They didn't come back the next day. That was the lesson. The city didn't want the truth. It wanted whiteness. It wanted purity, even if that purity came from poison. So he went back to the old ways, back to ash and alum, salt and vinegar. Back to lies baked at 400 degrees until they smelled like love. Necessity bakes strange recipes, he murmured to himself one night, turning a loaf in his hands. Its crust gleamed faintly in the lamplight, smooth and golden. He pressed his thumb into it, feeling the warmth seep into his skin. It was beautiful, in its way deadly, but beautiful. Outside, the fog thickened. The bells of street palls tolled in the distance, marking another morning. He slid the loaf onto the shelf beside the others, each one a small, perfect deceit. And as the first customers began to gather at the door, the baker wiped his hands, straightened his apron, and smiled. The smell of bread drifted once more into the street, warm, sweet, alive. The smell of desperation. The morning after faith began to sour, the smell of bread still drifted through the streets, though now, perhaps, it carried something sharper. Not everyone could name it, but those who could taste it on the air said it was fear. The kind that comes when comfort starts to look suspicious. For decades, Londoners had eaten their loaves without question. They had broken bread at tables, at altars, at deathbeds, believing in its purity as one believes in sunrise. But the illusion could not hold forever, and when it cracked, it did so not with thunder, but with ink. It began quietly, with murmurs in coffee houses and drawing rooms. A few physicians, troubled by the number of children dying from mysterious bowel ailments and strange wasting sicknesses, began to suspect something darker in the city's daily bread. They sent samples to laboratories, scraped crusts from shop shelves, and ground crumbs beneath glass lenses. What they found made them pale. Flour that glittered faintly under light, dusted not with purity but with plaster, chalk, and powdered bone. Traces of alum, caustic, and white, used to harden the dough and bleach the loaf. Even traces of lead from water pipes and milling tools. It was no wonder. One doctor wrote bitterly that London's poor were pale as their bread and dying nearly as fast. Soon, journalists caught the scent, and like hounds, they did not let go. The press, smelling a scandal, turned the discovery into a revelation. The bread of bone and bleach. London eats itself alive. The white loaf that whitens the grave. The headlines screamed from every corner. Newspapers sold faster than the bread they condemned. And yet, panic in the streets never quite took hold. Fear flickered. Yes, whispers at the market stalls. Hesitation at the baker's door, but habit is a stubborn thing. People might gasp at the news, but by evening they were slicing their loaves as usual, shaking their heads and saying, "Surely my baker would never." The bakers, for their part, said little. Some cursed the newspapers for their lies. Others stared into their ovens in silence, the orange light flickering over their faces like guilt made visible. One could imagine a man flour-streaked, weary, his arms dusted in scars, standing at his counter as a reporter thrusts a paper in his face. "Is this true?" the young man demands. The baker glances down, sees his trade laid bare in black letters, and only sighs. "I follow orders," he murmurs. "We all do." Because it was true. The fault was not just his. It was in the mills that cut the flour, the merchants who demanded purity, the customers who prized whiteness over honesty. He was a link in a long, unbroken chain of necessity, each hand passing the poison along because no one could afford to stop. And so the investigation spread, like fire through flour dust. Every week brought new revelations. Bones ground from slaughterhouses, alum sold by the ton, barrels of chalk stored in basements beside sacks of wheat. Inspectors began visiting bakeries, scraping residue from mixing troughs, and testing the color of the bread. What they found was not villainy, but something quieter and more terrible: resignation. The bakers did not protest innocence. They did not even feign surprise. Most only shrugged, tiredly, and went back to kneading. "What else are we to do?" one said. "If we don't use the alum, the loaves collapse. The customers complain. The shop closes." Others simply pointed upward, toward the unseen hierarchy that kept London fed and sick at once: the millers, the suppliers, the middlemen who diluted purity into profit. "If I bake honestly," one man said, "I starve honestly." Same ending, different flavor. By now, the newspapers had begun to romanticize them. The poisoned tradesmen, the dying bakers, the men who fed the city while slowly being consumed by it. Pain makes for good copy, and the Victorians loved their tragedies. Pamphlets appeared in parlors and pubs alike. One illustration showed a skeletal baker offering a loaf to death himself, the caption reading, "He who bakes for all, bakes also for the grave." But still, the ovens burned. The government, predictably, hesitated. To regulate flour meant to anger millers. To expose the adulteration meant to admit that the empire's daily bread, the same bread that fed soldiers, sailors, and orphans, was tainted. And so committees were formed, reports drafted, laws postponed. The machinery of reform creaked slowly while the machinery of hunger ran day and night. For every pamphlet condemning the corruption, there was a rebuttal from some respected figure claiming that a little alum had never killed anyone, and that public hysteria threatened the moral order. "Bread," one paper sniffed, "is sacred. To question it is to question civilization itself." And perhaps that was true. The baker read those words one evening, his eyes moving slowly over the column while a fresh batch rose in the oven. The fire's glow trembled across his tired face. Civilization. He almost laughed. Civilization, to him, was heat and sweat and the endless ache of survival. Civilization was scraping mold from flour, kneading poison into sustenance, and pretending the city's trust was not a weight on his chest. He turned the page. Another article, this one written by a doctor, described, in clinical detail, the autopsy of a child who had eaten aluminous bread. The stomach was raw, the bowels ulcerated, the bones frail as chalk. The words blurred as the baker read them, but he forced himself to finish. He set the paper aside, sat at his bench, and stared at his hands. They were white again, always white, though he no longer knew if it was flour or guilt. The next morning, the bakery was filled as usual. The same faces, the same coins, the same soft voices asking for loaves, as white as yesterday's. He hesitated only once, looking at the rows of bread cooling on the shelf, pale, perfect, deceitful, before he wrapped one in paper and handed it across the counter. The woman smiled, grateful. "God bless you," she said. He nodded, his lips dry. "And you," he whispered. That night, in taverns and parlors, people debated the scandal. Some dismissed it as nonsense. Others raged about greed and sin. But when the next morning came, they all ate breakfast. Denial is stronger than disgust, especially when one is hungry. The doctors wrote more reports. The journalists printed more horrors. And the bakers kept baking. The ovens burned hotter than ever, perhaps out of defiance, perhaps out of shame. The smell of bread filled the city once more, that same familiar perfume of faith and fire, now mixed with the faint sting of revelation. A few shops closed, ruined by panic, but most survived. London could live without truth, it seemed, but never without bread. And so the cycle continued. The investigators would publish, the people would gasp, the bakers would shrug, the loaves would rise, white as sin. In one newspaper illustration, published in 1870, a skeletal figure labeled "the baker" stood behind a counter, handing out bread to a line of ghosts. Beneath it, in small letters, read the caption, "He feeds them all, even after." The baker saw it once and didn't know whether to laugh or cry, perhaps both, because he knew, more than anyone, that it was true. The world had finally begun to see the poison, but by then, it was too late. The bread had already become part of them, as much faith as food. And faith, once swallowed, is not easily spit out. The next morning, as the first light crept into his shop, the baker struck the flint and lit his oven again. The fire roared, alive and indifferent. He leaned against the warm bricks, watching the glow spill across the floor. Outside, the fog rolled low and soft. The bells of street halls began to ring. He whispered to no one, "I only follow orders." And in the heart of London, the bread of bone and bleach continued to rise. The baker's whisper, "I only follow orders," lingered in the air long after the ovens had cooled. It was the kind of phrase that outlived the man who spoke it, settling over London like its own kind of smog. By the dawn of the 1860 seconds, the city itself seemed to groan under the weight of all its quiet sins. And now, at last, someone had begun to listen. Public outrage had finally ripened, slow, sour, inevitable. The journalists who had once been dismissed as sensationalists now printed their findings with proof in hand. Samples of chalk, ground bone, and alum displayed on lecture tables like relics of a collective betrayal. Lecturers toured London's halls and taverns, speaking to packed crowds about the dangers of adulterated bread. Pamphlets screamed from every street corner, their titles dramatic, their tone righteous. "Bread is life, not death," and "The people eat poison for breakfast." Oh, it was a moral crusade, as much about the soul as the stomach. The Victorians, so obsessed with virtue, had discovered impurity in their most sacred ritual, the daily breaking of bread. The shock was theological. To taint bread was to taint the body of Christ itself. Preachers thundered from pulpits that greed had corrupted the staff of life. Women, in parlors and markets, refused loaves they thought too white. The color of moral panic, it seemed, was pale. But as the righteous fury grew, so did the resistance. The millers blamed the bakers. The bakers blamed the merchants. The merchants blamed modern progress. And progress, as always, blamed necessity. Each link in the chain swore innocence, and the poison continued to pass quietly from hand to hand. Still, something had shifted. The clamor was too loud, too public, too embarrassing for Parliament to ignore. London's hunger had become a political issue. Doctors, scientists, and reformers petitioned, testified, and published essays that read more like sermons than science. They described mothers poisoned, children wasting away, soldiers too weak to march all victims, they claimed, of the nation's own bread. Finally, in 1860, Parliament relented. The Food Adulteration Act, a title grander than its power, was passed. It outlawed the deliberate contamination of food, including flour and bread. Violators could, in theory, be fined or imprisoned, but the law had no inspectors, no enforcement, no funding. It was, as one critic sneered, a loaf without yeast. full of good intentions but destined to fall flat. The narrator might say, sometimes progress starts as paperwork. And indeed, that was all it was: paper, ink, hope, and the illusion of change. Yet, even illusions matter. For the first time, the government had admitted that the people's food could be poison, that survival itself required oversight. It was the first tremor of modern regulation, the faint bureaucratic heartbeat of public health. But in the bakehouses of London, little changed. The ovens still roared before dawn. The air was still thick with flour and sweat. The men still coughed until they spat white into the fire. And when they read about the new law in the newspapers, they only laughed. "Parliament can't bake bread," one baker muttered. "They wouldn't last an hour in here." And he was right. The law did nothing to fix the hunger that forced men to adulterate in the first place. It did not lower the price of wheat, or raise wages, or teach the public to love brown bread. It only declared, in polite language, that certain acts were wrong, as if naming sin were the same as curing it. The millers kept cutting the flour. The merchants kept selling it. And the bakers, the tired ghosts of London's dawn, kept mixing, kneading, and burning their hands in the same ovens. In one corner bakery, the same old man who had whispered, "I only follow orders," lived to see the new law come into effect. He was too weary to mock it, too cynical to celebrate. One morning, he found a pamphlet slipped under his door. "Bread reform begins," it proclaimed, with a sketch of a smiling baker holding a clean white loaf. The irony made him chuckle, and then cough until he nearly fainted. He hung the pamphlet by the door anyway. It made customers feel safer. For a time, it even worked. People wanted to believe in reform as much as they had once believed in bread. They looked at their loaves differently now, turning them over in their hands, sniffing them as though the truth might reveal itself. But hunger dulls suspicion, and within a few months, the queues returned. Meanwhile, the newspapers moved on to fresher scandals. A railway crash, a new play, a royal engagement. Bread, like sin, had become mundane again. Yet in the quiet spaces in the cellars where bakers worked through the night, the talk of reform never quite died. Younger men began to whisper about change, about unions, about safer ovens and fairer wages. The word adulteration became a kind of curse, not just against flour, but against the whole system that demanded deceit in exchange for survival. The old baker listened but said little. He'd seen enough laws, enough promises, enough deaths. Still, something in him softened when he watched the young ones talk. Perhaps hope, like yeast, could rise even from decay. He often thought of the city itself as one vast bakery, its people, the dough, its progress, the fire. The reformers were trying to change the recipe, but London had been kneaded too long in greed and soot. It would not rise cleanly. Not yet. Years later, historians would call the 1860 Act the first step toward modern food safety. They would speak of it with pride, as if parchment alone could cleanse the ovens, as if laws could heal lungs. But to the men who worked in those brick-walled rooms, progress was measured not in legislation, but in breath, in how many hours they could go before coughing, in how many years before collapsing. The baker lived to see inspectors introduced in the 1870 seconds, men in waistcoats with clipboards, poking flour with spoons, nodding gravely as if that could undo the past. He didn't resent them. He pitied them, in a way. They believed in the law like his customers, once believed in bread earnestly, blindly, beautifully, and perhaps belief was the only ingredient progress ever really needed. On his final night in the shop, the baker leaned against the oven and watched the last batch rise. The air shimmered with heat. The loaves cracked softly as they baked. Outside, the city murmured, a low, endless hum. Somewhere beyond the fog, Parliament slept, proud of its paper victory. He thought again of the phrase that had haunted him for years, "I only follow orders." He whispered it once more, though this time it sounded less like surrender and more like confession. The bread on the shelves gleamed pale and perfect under the gaslight. He smiled faintly, wondering if perhaps, someday, the world would finally taste the truth if progress, however slow, would someday bake something pure. Sometimes, the narrator muses, as the light fades, progress starts as paperwork, but even paperwork can feed a revolution, one crumb at a time. And as dawn crept over London once again, The city woke to its daily ritual, the smell of bread rising through the fog. Familiar, comforting, and, for the first time, just a little less deadly. The first time the baker saw one, he thought it was a priest, a black coat, a notebook in hand, a stern look that spoke of judgment. But instead of a Bible, the man carried a magnifying glass and a clipboard. The baker squinted through the haze of flour, dust, and coal smoke and realized this was the future everyone had been talking about. An inspector. By the 1,870 seconds, the quiet promise that had once lived only on parchment began to take shape in flesh and bone. The Food Adulteration Act, that feeble piece of paper passed years earlier, had finally grown teeth. The government, at last, decided that purity was not merely moral, but measurable. So they sent men in waistcoats, with brass instruments and solemn eyes, to walk the streets of London and pry into the ovens that had fed it for centuries. They arrived without warning. One morning, the baker opened his door to find two of them standing there, boots polished, expressions grave. They stepped inside without a word, their noses twitching as they inhaled the warm, yeasty air, that same air that once meant comfort, now an object of suspicion. One of them scribbled in his notebook, while the other ran a gloved finger along the mixing table, lifting a pinch of flour to the light. "Whiter than it should be," the inspector murmured. The baker said nothing. They asked questions too many, too fast. Where did his flour come from? Did he use alum? What fuel did he burn? How long had the oven been in operation? The baker, who had spent his life working in silence, found himself stammering before these men of order and ink. When they left, they took samples, small cloth bundles of dough and crumbs, labeled neatly and sealed with wax. Days later, a notice arrived. A fine. It was more than he earned in a week. His crime: suspicion of adulteration. No proof, just suspicion. He paid it anyway. Fighting the government was like fighting the wind, it always won. And yet, as the months passed, more inspectors appeared. They moved through the city in pairs, clicking their pens, sniffing their samples, and leaving a trail of uneasy silence behind them. Bakeries that had once flourished began to falter. The poorer ones closed. Others scraped by with cleaner flour, thinner margins, heavier hearts. The bakers grumbled, of course. They muttered about government meddling, about men who'd never held a shovel of coal telling them how to bake. In taverns, after long shifts, they would curse the new rules between gulps of ale. "They don't know what it's like," one man spat, "to feed a city that won't pay for purity." Another laughed bitterly. "Maybe they should try kneading a day's bread with a quill." Still, beneath the resentment, there was something else. A slow, grudging relief. The kind that comes when a wound finally starts to close, even if it stings to touch. Because little by little, the poisons began to fade. The millers stopped cutting their flour, fearful of losing contracts. Merchants demanded certificates of purity. Alum, once sold by the sack, grew rarer. Bread darkened, ever so slightly. The taste of chalk dulled. The city, unknowingly, began to breathe a little easier. For the first time in a generation, fewer people were dying from breakfast. The baker noticed it in quiet ways. Fewer coughing fits among his apprentices. Fewer customers complaining of stomach cramps or strange fevers. The air in the bakery, though still thick and hot, felt somehow lighter. He couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the new flour, or perhaps just the idea that the government now watched, that someone, somewhere, cared whether the bread killed or cured. He didn't trust the inspectors, not entirely, but he had to admit they were thorough. They turned the city into a laboratory, its streets into test sites. Every week, newspapers printed the results of their investigations like gossip columns. Which baker fined? Which mill caught cheating? Which district now deemed clean? It became a kind of sport, a new ritual of modern life, watching morality measured by a microscope. And London, for all its cynicism, loved it. The Victorians were nothing if not enamored with order. The same people who once trusted blind faith now trusted data. They devoured statistics the way they once devoured sermons. Parts per million became a kind of prayer. To the inspectors, every crumb was evidence. To the bakers, every visit was a trial. But to the city, it was progress. The baker grew older as the rules multiplied. There were forms to fill, records to keep, and ingredients to declare. The bureaucracy of purity was endless. He grumbled like the rest, but secretly, he had stopped cutting corners. He still baked through the night, still coughed when the flour rose in clouds, but the flour was clean now, and that mattered more than he'd expected. Sometimes he would see the inspectors in the market, talking to housewives and vendors, their hats gleaming in the sunday. They had become part of the city's rhythm, like lamplighters or postmen, men who walked the boundary between danger and order. And while most bakers despised them, the old man found himself oddly comforted by their presence. It meant that someone was watching, even if too late. Once, an inspector returned to his shop, younger than the others, eager, nervous, polite. He looked around, taking notes, then paused by the oven. "My father was a baker," he said. "He died of the dust. I joined this service because I wanted to change that." The old man said nothing, but for the first time in years, he smiled. That night, as the city slept, he watched the dough rise and thought of all the hands that had suffered before him, men who had fed London with their lungs, who had burned their bodies for its comfort. Perhaps the law could not bring them back, but perhaps in some small, slow way, it could stop others from joining them. Progress, he realized, was not a clean thing. It was like bread itself. It rose unevenly, cracked in strange places, but still, somehow, fed the world. Years passed. The inspectors grew more confident, the laws more defined. Chemical testing improved. Falsified flour could be spotted in an instant. Factories began labeling ingredients. Words like purity and quality became selling points. The newspapers praised the new order. London's bakers, once ghosts in basements, were now craftsmen of respectability again. The old baker never stopped working. He was too stubborn to retire, too used to the rhythm of the fire and the quiet company of the dough. But as he looked around his small shop cleaner now, brighter, with whitewashed walls and open windows, he knew the world had changed. There were fewer funerals among the trade. The apprentices laughed more and coughed less. The flour came from sacks, marked inspected in bold letters, stamped with the seal of the city. The loaves, though not as white as before, sold just as well. People had learned, finally, that safety had its own kind of beauty. One morning, long after the inspectors had gone, the baker stood by his oven and watched the steam rise. He could almost hear the voices of the past in it, the grumbling men, the coughing children, the ghosts of his own youth. And somewhere beneath it all, faint but unbroken, was that whisper he'd carried for decades. "I only follow orders." He said it one last time, softly, almost amused. But now, it meant something different. Not surrender continuity, not guilt survival. Outside, the street was alive with the smell of bread, rich and honest, no longer hiding its sins beneath a mask of chalk. The fog had lifted, if only a little. In the bakeries of London, the fires still burned, but the city breathed easier. The inspectors still walked the streets, their notebooks thick with numbers, their boots clicking on cobblestone. And though many mocked them, the baker knew they were the thin line between old ghosts and new beginnings. The narrator muses quietly. It took centuries for the world to realize that even bread, that simplest symbol of life, could turn deadly if left unwatched. And so, the watchers came. They brought clipboards instead of swords, data instead of prayers. They were mocked, resisted, ignored, and yet, somehow, fewer people died from breakfast. Oh, it was not a revolution of fire or faith, but of ink, patience, and persistence. The slow rise of reason in a world that had baked too long in superstition and hunger. And in that small victory, somewhere between law and loaf, the baker finally found peace. The world had shifted quietly beneath the baker's feet, though at first he hardly noticed. The same streets still hummed with carts and carriages. The same fog rolled over London's rooftops, and the same morning bells tolled from distant spires. Yet something subtle had changed in the rhythm of life itself. The city no longer coughed when it woke. The air no longer burned with flour, dust, and coal smoke. Even the bakeries, once dark caves of heat and exhaustion, had begun to gleam like laboratories. London had risen from its haze of poison into something cleaner, sharper, almost modern. The baker saw it everywhere, in the white coats where rags once hung, in the glint of polished scales where guesswork once ruled, in the hum of new machines that ground, mixed, and measured with precision no human hand could match. The age of sweat and soot was fading. In its place came an age of control. Mechanized mills now did the labor of hundreds, their gears whirring with mechanical certainty. The flour they produced was sifted, refined, and certified by government standards. Gas ovens replaced coal fires. Their steady heat made perfect loaves without the burns and scars that had once marked a man's trade. For the first time in his life, the baker could test the temperature without testing his own flesh. He remembered the old ovens, those brick beasts that breathed fire, that demanded his skin as proof of skill. The scars on his arms, once badges of mastery, now looked like relics from a barbaric age. His apprentices no longer earned them. They wore sleeves and gloves, worked by the soft hiss of gas instead of the roar of flame. Their lungs were clear. Their laughter came easily. He did not envy them, though sometimes he pitied them. They would never know what it meant to fight the fire and win. The city called it progress, and perhaps it was. The bread was cleaner, lighter, safer. Customers no longer feared what hid beneath the crust. Even the word baker had changed its meaning. Once, it had conjured an image of a tired man bent over a table, coughing into the dough. Now, it meant craftsmanship, precision, pride, artistry. Bakeries displayed their loaves like jewels behind glass, their names painted in gold leaf. Men in uniforms stood behind spotless counters, greeting customers with polished courtesy instead of flour-streaked fatigue. The trade that had once been whispered about in pity was now spoken of with respect. The baker, old now, his hair as white as the flour he had once cursed, would walk past these new shops and pause to watch. Through the clear windows, he saw young men at work in tidy kitchens, their movements calm, efficient, almost elegant. There was no shouting, no choking heat, no rush of panic when the oven flared too high. Everything gleamed, the brass, the marble, the uniforms. He would nod to himself, both proud and wistful. He could not deny that this new world was better, safer, healthier, more human. Yet somewhere beneath his approval lingered a faint ache, like an echo of the old fire that still smoldered in his bones. He missed the noise, the chaos, the sweat that made every loaf feel earned. He missed the camaraderie born of danger, the quiet respect among men who had suffered the same burns, breathed the same dust, lived and died by the same flame. These new bakers would never carry those ghosts. They would never know the price of their comfort. Still, he was grateful. For the first time, children grew up without coughing. The apprentices no longer collapsed before 30. The bread is fed without killing. The inspectors once ridiculed. Now routine came and went like clockwork, testing samples, checking temperatures, nodding with bureaucratic satisfaction. Their presence no longer frightened anyone. It was simply part of the rhythm of cleanliness. Mechanized mills thundered on the outskirts of the city, their endless grind feeding the empire's appetite. Wheat came by rail and ship from every corner of the globe. A single mill could feed 100,000 mouths. To the baker, it felt almost godlike, this power to nourish a nation without ever touching the grain. He sometimes wondered if something sacred had been lost in the exchange. The intimacy of labor, perhaps, the humility of the hands. But when he looked at the bright faces of the new generation, their clear lungs, unscarred arms, their easy smiles, he knew it was worth the trade. They had given up suffering for sanitation, a fair exchange, the narrator might say, and he would be right. The transformation spread beyond the bakeries. Cleanliness became a creed, hygiene a new faith. Posters hung in shop windows proclaiming pure bread for a modern Britain. Advertisements boasted of mechanical precision and scientific baking. The language of industry had replaced the poetry of the hearth. It sounded cold, perhaps, but the results were undeniable. The city grew healthier. The poor lived longer. The bread no longer hid its sins. The baker sometimes laughed at the irony. For centuries, bread had been both salvation and poison, faith and deceit. Now, in the age of machines and gaslight, it was simply food again, plain, honest, and unremarkable. Perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. One afternoon, as he sat outside his shop, the sun low and amber in the sky, a young baker approached him. The boy wore a crisp white jacket and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never known the sting of a coal burn. He recognized the old man and stopped, smiling politely. "You must have seen everything change," the boy said. "Was it really as bad as they say?" The old baker looked at his hands, gnarled, cracked, and pale, and then at the boy's spotless cuffs. "Worse," he said softly. "But it was the fire that taught us to respect the bread." The boy hesitated, unsure if he was being warned or blessed. The old man smiled faintly. "You're lucky," he added. "You bake without pain. Keep it that way." And when the boy left, the baker watched him disappear into the clean light of the new century, a world that would never know the ghosts he carried. That night, he sat by the oven one last time. The new gas flame purred gently, steady and obedient. He placed a loaf inside, closed the door, and waited. There was no smoke, no soot, no danger, only silence. The bread rose perfectly, its crust smooth and golden. He took it out, broke it in half, and smiled at the simple perfection of it. It was the kind of bread he had spent his whole life, chasing clean, safe, honest. And yet, as he tasted it, he could almost feel the echo of the old world beneath its calm surface. The heat, the dust, the laughter in the dark. History had baked itself into him, and he could never quite scrub it away. When the morning came, he left the loaf on the counter and walked outside into the chill London air. The city was alive, shining with progress iron rails, gas lamps, machines humming in distant mills, and through it all drifted the same scent as ever, warm, comforting, eternal. The smell of bread. Only now, it carried no poison, no lie, no sorrow. It was the smell of survival, of a trade reborn, of pain redeemed by progress. The narrator, smiling faintly, observes, "They traded suffering for sanitation, a fair exchange." For the first time in centuries, the bakers of London no longer fed death. They fed life, and the world at last was ready to taste it. The smell of bread lingered in the morning, air warm, sweet, familiar as if nothing had changed. But history, like the yeast that gave life to the dough, never truly stopped rising. It simply shifted shape. The baker was gone now, his shop long since replaced by glass and steel, his fire extinguished and reborn 1,000 times in electric ovens across the world. And yet the story of his craft of purity and poison had never really ended. It had only modernized. In the polished bakeries of the new century, stainless steel replaced soot, thermometers replaced instinct, and paper hats replaced scars. But beneath the hum of machinery and the gleam of cleanliness, the same old ghost stirred the ghost of profit. It wore a new face now, one of science and efficiency, but its hunger was unchanged. Every generation, it seemed, forgot the lesson written in the baker's breath, that progress without conscience always curdles. The narrator might have smiled sadly at the irony. They had traded alum for additives, bone dust for preservatives, arsenic for artificial sweeteners. The poisons had evolved, but the logic remained identical: sell more, spend less, trust chemistry to disguise decay. In the old days, the deceit had been hidden in the dough. Now, it was printed on the label. "We never stopped eating danger," the narrator muses. "We just learned to print it on the label." Indeed, the language of deceit had grown polite: low-fat, sugar-free, fortified, natural flavoring. The modern baker no longer scraped chalk into flour, but he did pump air into dough to make it seem lighter, fresher, more divine. The scientists who designed the process called it innovation. The advertisers called it health. The consumers called it progress, and swallowed it gratefully. Factories that once fed neighborhoods now fed nations. Bread came sealed in plastic, stamped with expiration dates instead of trust. The old intimacy between baker and buyer was gone. The loaf no longer carried a man's fingerprints, only a barcode. And though the world congratulated itself on hygiene and precision, something essential had been lost: the human knowledge of what exactly we were eating. The narrator, ever wry, might whisper that this ignorance was not accidental but engineered. For what the Victorians had done in basements with alum and bone, modern corporations now do in laboratories with polymers and dyes. The difference was one of scale. A single Victorian baker could poison a street. A modern one could poison a continent. And all with the blessing of law. In this new world, science became both savior and scapegoat. It promised abundance bread that never molded, sweets that never spoiled, flavors that never faded. But abundance came at a cost, as it always had. The body adapted slowly. The profit margin did not. Each year brought a new ingredient, a new innovation, a new quiet danger disguised as convenience. The bakers of the past had hidden their sins beneath flour. The modern world printed them proudly on nutritional charts, confident that a warning in fine print was absolution enough. The baker's tragedy had become the century's parable. Purity always sells, but never pays. And so, the pattern repeated. When flour became cheap, it was bleached whiter still. When sugar became scarce, chemistry invented substitutes. When demand outpaced patience, machines learned to mimic fermentation, churning out loaves that looked alive but never truly breathed. The bread of the modern age was perfect in every way except truth. If one were to peel back the glossy packaging, one would find the same story, told in a new language. The exhaustion of workers replaced by automation, the deceit of millers replaced by marketing, the sickness of the lungs replaced by the sickness of the gut. The tools had changed, but the temptation had not. The narrator reflects that history, when stripped of its costumes, is nothing more than a loop of hunger and hope. The Victorians believed white bread was purity. The modern world believes the same of its processed lightness, the same smooth, spotless perfection that once killed slowly, now sells in supermarkets by the ton. Humanity's faith in appearances remains unbroken, even when appearances are precisely what kill it. In a way, the baker's ghost still works among us. He no longer wakes before dawn to knead dough with blistered hands, but his descendants labor under fluorescent lights, guided not by instinct, but by policy. The factory hums, the conveyor belts spin, the ovens blaze with calibrated precision. Somewhere, in the blur of motion, the same quiet compromise is made between honesty and survival, purity and profit. No one questions it. Why would they? The bread is warm, the shelves are full, and he labels a sure safety. The sins are written down now, not hidden, merely disguised in complexity. Calories, emulsifiers, preservatives, terms too clean, too clinical, to sound dangerous. The narrator sighs. We no longer believe in miracles. We believe in shelf life. And yet, there is something hauntingly familiar in the rhythm of it all. The same faith that once drove Londoners to trust the whiteness of their bread now drives the modern world to trust the fine print on the back of a box. The faith has not died. It has only changed its altar. Every century, it seems, invents its own form of blindness. The Victorians were blinded by class, by the illusion of refinement. The modern age is blinded by convenience, by the illusion of control. Both mistakes stem from the same root, a refusal to see what lies beneath the crust. The narrator, with his usual dark humor, might add, "At least the Victorians could blame ignorance. We have no such excuse." In boardrooms and laboratories, men in suits debate the same questions the bakers once asked by firelight: how to feed the world cheaply, quickly, beautifully. And like their predecessors, they find their answers in compromise. Every new formula is a quiet trade. A little less health for a little more profit, a little more flavor for a little less truth. It is, as ever, the old recipe for progress. The baker's ghost would recognize the smell instantly. It is not the scent of bread, but of ambition, warm, rich, irresistible. Still, humanity is not without memory. The story of the Victorian baker, once forgotten, returns now in documentaries and essays, told with the comfortable distance of hindsight. We shake our heads at their ignorance, their filth, their crude adulterations. We marvel at how far we have come. Yet the shelves of our supermarkets tell a quieter truth, that we never stopped baking the same lies. We simply learned to make them palatable. The old man would have smiled at that, perhaps even laughed, the bitter, weary laugh of someone who knows that every civilization convinces itself it is cleaner than the last. He might have leaned against his oven, arms folded, watching the bright packages of the modern age roll off the line. "So," he'd murmur, "you've still not learned. History is nothing if not a teacher that no one listens to. The Victorian baker suffered and died so that others might bake safely, and yet here we stand, still feeding the world on illusion. The narrator's voice softens, almost kind now. We like to believe we've tamed danger, that we've scrubbed it sterile, wrapped it in labels, and measured it by the gram. But danger doesn't disappear. It just evolves. And perhaps the real poison isn't in the bread at all, but in the forgetting the comfort that comes when we mistake progress for purity. And the smell of bread still fills the air, sweet and inviting. But somewhere beneath it lingers the same uneasy truth the baker once knew too well, that hunger, left unchecked, always eats morality first. And so, the ovens keep burning. The hands have changed, the tools have changed, the recipes have changed, but the story remains the same. The bread still rises. The world still believes. The poison, as always, just wears a cleaner face. The story of danger had come full circle. The world had learned to bake without poison, to package safety, to mass-produce perfection, and yet, beneath the quiet hum of every modern bakery, the ghosts of the past still lingered. The narrator, still hovering between irony and sorrow, might begin with the faint scent of yeast and warmth that fills the dawn streets of any city today. The smell is timeless, that same sweet perfume that once meant survival in Victorian London, now sterilized, standardized, safe. Yet if you pause long enough, if you listen through the whir of mixers and the hiss of gas ovens, you might hear something faint behind it, the echo of a cough. The irony is baked into every loaf. The bakers of today wear white coats, pressed and immaculate, the color of purity and hygiene. They move through spotless rooms of steel and glass, hands gloved, faces calm. But white, once upon a time, was the color that killed. It was the shade of deception, the chalk and alum and bone that bleached Victorian bread into a deadly promise. Now, it has become the uniform of virtue. The narrator might smile, faintly, and say, history has a dark sense of humor. In the age of Queen Victoria, whiteness meant aspiration, the illusion of refinement, the proof of civility. The poor wanted white bread because the rich had it. The rich wanted it because it symbolized moral purity. And so, men died chasing it, breathing its dust, swallowing its poison, whitening the world until it turned pale with sickness. Now, a century and a half later, the same color hangs on every baker's shoulders as a mark of professionalism, safety, and control. The very hue that once hid corruption now signals its absence. Progress, it seems, loves irony. Step into a modern bakery before dawn, say 4 in the morning. The air is clean, the lights are bright, and the machines hum with tireless rhythm. Flour pours from stainless steel hoppers, perfectly measured, its dust trapped behind filters and vents. The bakers move with quiet precision, their movements almost ritualistic, their white coats glowing faintly under fluorescent light. The bread they make will rise evenly, golden and wholesome. There is no fear of alum, no cough, no soot. And yet, as the first loaves emerge, steaming and perfect, there's a sense that the walls remember. For these places, these warm sanctuaries of comfort, are built upon centuries of suffering. Every brick and beam carries a faint inheritance of sweat and ash. The trade itself refined, mechanized, professional is the direct descendant of men who worked half-blind in smoke and darkness, whose lungs turned to chalk, whose blood carried the same whiteness they chased in their bread. It is a strange kind of legacy, invisible, unsentimental, but unerasable. The narrator lingers here, soft and almost reverent. They baked life for others, he says, and breathed death for themselves. The line is both an epitaph and a truth. Each loaf that left a Victorian oven was a small miracle of endurance made by hands that trembled, shaped by lungs that fought for air. They fed a city that never thought to thank them. And now, though the danger is gone, their memory lives on not in monuments or museums, but in every loaf that rises before the world wakes. In a quiet sense, every modern baker owes them a breath. The clean air they inhale is borrowed from those who inhaled dust. The white coat they wear is the redemption of a color that once damned their craft. The safety protocols, The filtered vents, the regulated ingredients, all are the inheritance of lives spent proving what purity costs when no one demands it. The modern world rarely remembers this. We see bread as comfort, as the simplest symbol of peace and abundance. It fills our tables, our markets, our morning routines. But to the Victorians, it was the measure of survival itself. Bread was not food. It was morality, identity, life. The fact that it killed them made the tragedy poetic and the irony eternal. Even now, when the world sleeps and the bakers begin their shift, the pattern repeats. The streets outside are silent, fog curling against the glass. Inside, the air hums with warmth and quiet dedication. The dough, pale and pliant, rises beneath careful hands. The same devotion remains the discipline of feeding others while the rest of the world dreams. The only difference is that now the bakers can breathe while they work. And perhaps that is the true legacy. Not the whiteness, not the perfection, but the endurance. Humanity has always built its progress on the shoulders of the unseen, those who worked through the dark so others could wake to light. The Victorian bakers were such people. They never led revolutions, never spoke in parliament, never appeared in the newspapers except as statistics. Yet their suffering shaped a system that would one day protect everyone who labors in the heat. They were, in their own way, quiet reformers. Still, the narrator cannot resist one last sigh, the kind that carries both pride and pity. "We have learned to bake safely," he murmurs, "but we have not learned to remember." Modern bakeries produce loaves by the thousands, each one flawless, each one anonymous. The artistry is perfect, but the soul is faint. The men who once risked their lungs for a single loaf would scarcely recognize their craft in this sanitized age. And yet, perhaps, they would approve. They might look at the gleaming ovens, the spotless coats, the clean white bread and say, "At last, you have earned it." The irony is that, in perfecting bread, we have made it ordinary again. What was once a deadly profession has become a daily ritual, so safe that we hardly notice it. We've turned tragedy into routine, danger into comfort. And in that transformation lies both triumph and forgetfulness. Sometimes, when the narrator passes a bakery in the early hours, he swears he can still smell a trace of the old world beneath the sweetness, a faint edge of smoke, a ghost of heat. He imagines the figures who came before, the boy sweeping the ash pit, the man kneading dough by candlelight, the cough echoing in the narrow room. They are gone now, but not vanished. Their breath is in the air, their dust in the flour, their endurance in every loaf. So the story ends as quietly as it began, with a man, an oven, and a promise. The promise that labor, even when it kills, leaves something behind, something invisible, but alive. The baker's trade endured not because it was profitable, but because it was necessary. And in that necessity lies the strange grace of history, the way pain ripens into progress, the way suffering turns, somehow, into safety. The narrator, voice soft and distant, concludes, "They baked life for others and breathed death for themselves." Their reward is not remembrance, but continuity, the simple miracle that bread still rises, warm and clean, while the world still sleeps. Outside, dawn breaks. The first loaves leave the oven, golden in the light. The scent drifts through the city, comforting, ordinary, holy. Few who breathe it will ever think of the men who once died for it, but the air remembers, and that, perhaps, is enough. The story of the Victorian baker, when all the soot and flour settle, is not merely about bread. It is about trust, blind, desperate trust, in the things that feed us. It is about ignorance, not cruel or willful, but the kind born from hunger and habit. And, most of all, it is about resilience, the kind that wakes before dawn, breathes poison, and still finds strength to knead the dough of another morning. Every loaf they made was a wager between life and death, between skill and survival. Each crust was a small, fragile victory, proof that, even in the dirtiest corners of industrial progress, humanity still tried to make something good, something that could be shared. Bread, in their hands, became both a miracle and a weapon, nourishment for others, ruin for themselves. Yet they never stopped baking. The fire burned, the city ate, and London grew fat on their quiet endurance. They had no machines to shield them, No laws to protect them, no unions to plead their case, only their hands, their lungs, and their will. They labored until their skin cracked, until their breath turned shallow, until the world they fed had no memory of their faces. Still, they rose before dawn to stoke the ovens, to feed the empire, to keep the illusion of comfort alive. In a city built on smoke and steel, it was the bakers who gave London its warmth. The narrator lingers on that thought, a moment of reverence amid the ashes. They worked with nothing but their hands, their lungs, and their stubborn will to feed a city that barely noticed them. And that is their legacy. Not the whiteness of their bread, not the perfection of their crust, but the endurance that outlived them. The clean ovens we take for granted, the sterile counters, the ingredient labels, the inspectors with their clipboards, all of it was bought with the coughs and blisters of men who had none of those things. Their suffering became regulation. Their deaths became prevention. Every health code, every standard, every promise of purity is, in some quiet way, written in their breath. The story of the Victorian baker is, in truth, the story of progress itself. Born in hardship, tempered by ignorance, perfected through pain, it reminds us that safety is never free, that comfort is built upon the invisible bones of those who had none. So, the next time the smell of bread drifts from a warm shop on a quiet street, pause for a moment. That scent, soft, sweet, alive, carries centuries of labor. It carries the memory of those who baked in darkness so others could eat in light. The laws that protect us today, the labels, the standards, the clean ovens were built on their silent suffering. They fed a city that never saw them. But through every loaf that rises now, they rise, too, still feeding the world, still breathing through the warmth they left behind.